Welcome to the multiverse of anime. If you enjoy exploring alternate realities where heroes fall and villains rise, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share our channel for more mind-bending stories. 5 years. 5 years of peace shattered in a single moment when Jine's voice echoed across the cosmos, carrying with it a terror that would make even the gods tremble. Picture this, Kakarot stands atop the ruins of what was once Capsule Corporation, his golden aura flickering against the crimson sky. But this isn't the Kakarot you know. His eyes burn with an otherworldly light, his very presence causing reality to fracture like broken glass around him. In his hands, he holds the lifeless body of his own son, Gohan, while behind him, the earth itself begins to crack apart under the weight of his grief and rage. This is what happens when survival comes at a price too terrible to imagine. But let me take you back to where it all began to unravel. 3 months ago, when dimensional tears first started appearing around Earth, nobody understood what they meant. The Z-Fighters dismissed them as after effects of their previous battles. Bulma's instruments detected strange energy readings, but the signatures made no sense. They were Saiyan, but wrong somehow, as if the very concept of what a Saiyan could be had been twisted into something unrecognizable. The first sign of true horror came when Raditz woke up screaming. Not just once, but every night for 2 weeks straight. He spoke of voices calling to him from the void, of Saiyans trapped between dimensions, of his mother's desperate cries echoing across space and time. Kakarot tried to comfort his brother, but deep down, a cold dread had begun to settle in his heart. Then came the morning when Gohan found his father standing in the gravity chamber staring at his own reflection with an expression of absolute terror. The boy had never seen his father afraid of anything, but there Kakarot stood trembling as he whispered to his own image, "You're not supposed to exist. None of us are." The dimensional fractures grew larger each day. Through them, brief glimpses of other realities bled through. In one, they saw Vegeta as a child, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a universe destroyer. In another, they witnessed Frieza and Goku fighting side by side against an enemy so terrible that even their combined might seemed insignificant. Most disturbing of all was the flash of a reality where Chi-Chi stood over Kakarot's broken body, her gentle hands stained with his blood as she whispered, "I had to stop you before you consumed everything." But nothing could have prepared them for what happened when the first survivor emerged from the dimensional chaos. She materialized in the middle of West City during the afternoon rush hour, her arrival accompanied by a shockwave that shattered every window within a 5-mile radius. Gine stepped out of a swirling vortex of energy, her Saiyan armor cracked and bloodied, her eyes wild with desperate urgency. She looked exactly as she had 25 years ago, unchanged by time, which should have been impossible. But it was what she carried that truly chilled everyone to the bone. In her arms was another version of herself, this one aged and broken, her face bearing scars that seemed to shift and change as you looked at them. The dying Jin whispered something to her younger self, and when those words were spoken, reality itself seemed to recoil in horror. Even now, none of the Z-Fighters can repeat what they heard without feeling their sanity slip away piece by piece. The younger Gine looked up at the assembled heroes, her gaze stopping on Kakarot. For a moment, pure joy flickered across her face as she saw her son alive and grown. But then her expression changed to one of absolute despair as she spoke the words that would doom them all. "My son, I've found you at last, but I'm afraid I've brought something with me that should never have existed. We tried to stop him, tried to contain him, but he's already here. He's been here all along, waiting in the spaces between moments, growing stronger with each reality he consumes." She gestured to the dimensional tears spreading across the sky like infected wounds. Every choice we didn't make, every path we didn't take, every possibility we never explored. He's been there, feeding on the potential of what could have been. And now he's strong enough to make all realities bend to his will. Vegeta stepped forward, his royal pride masking the fear they all felt. "Who are you talking about, woman? What enemy could possibly threaten us after everything we've overcome?" Jin's laugh was hollow, broken, the sound of someone who had seen horrors beyond comprehension. "Enemy? Oh my prince, you still don't understand. The greatest threat to the multiverse isn't some cosmic tyrant or ancient evil. It's the one possibility we never considered, the one timeline we were never supposed to see." She pointed directly at Kakarot, her finger trembling. "It's him. It's you, my son. In the reality I escaped from, you achieved power beyond imagination, but it came at the cost of your humanity. You became what we call the devourer of possibilities, consuming entire timelines to feed your ever-growing strength. And the worst part? You did it all because you thought you were protecting everyone." The gathered heroes stared in shocked silence as Jin continued her terrible revelation. "He's not evil, not in any way we could fight or understand. He's love twisted into something monstrous, protection turned into annihilation, the need to save everyone pushed to such extremes that he destroys the very concept of existence to ensure nothing can ever hurt those he cares about again." But even that wasn't the most terrifying part of her warning. The version of you that became the devourer, he's been watching this timeline, learning from it, preparing to claim it as his own. Every battle you've won, every friend you've saved, every moment of happiness you've experienced, he sees it as proof that this reality is worth preserving above all others. And to preserve it, he's willing to sacrifice every other possible version of existence. As if summoned by her words, the sky above them began to tear open with a sound like reality itself screaming. Through the growing rift, they could see him, Kakarot, but not as he was meant to be. His body was wreathed in an aura that wasn't golden, but the deep black of consumed starlight. His eyes held the weight of infinite timelines, and when he smiled, it was with the love of a father who would burn down the universe to keep his children safe. But before anyone could react, before the assembled heroes could even begin to process what they were seeing, the dimensional rift snapped shut with a sound like thunder. The devourer was gone, but his presence lingered like a poison in the air. Gine collapsed to her knees, the effort of crossing dimensions finally overwhelming her. As Kakarot rushed to catch his mother, she grabbed his arm with desperate strength and whispered words that would haunt him forever. "He's coming, my son, and when he arrives, he won't be coming to conquer or destroy. He'll be coming to save us all, whether we want to be saved or not. The question isn't whether we can stop him. The question is whether we'll still be ourselves when he's finished loving us." The dying version of Gine in her arms stirred one final time, her voice barely audible as she spoke her last words. "Tell me, in this timeline, did Broly ever learn to control his power? Because in the reality I escaped, he became the only one strong enough to fight the devourer. But the cost of that battle, the price of matching such terrible love with equally terrible rage, it broke him in ways that rewrote the very concept of destruction itself." And then she was gone, crumbling to dust that was caught and scattered by a wind that smelled of burned possibilities and shattered dreams. As the survivors stood in stunned silence, processing the implications of what they had just learned, none of them noticed the small crack that had appeared in the concrete at their feet. It was barely visible, just a hairline fracture in the pavement, but through it seeped a darkness that was not the absence of light, but the presence of love so absolute that it consumed everything it touched. The war for every possible reality had begun, and the enemy they faced wasn't a destroyer or a conqueror, but a protector whose love had grown so vast and terrible that it threatened to collapse all of existence into a single perfect moment where nothing could ever go wrong again. But this is only the beginning of a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about heroism, sacrifice, and the true cost of loving someone enough to damn the entire multiverse for their safety. What happens when the greatest hero becomes the ultimate threat? What do you do when the one person you trust most in any reality becomes the one thing capable of ending all realities? And most terrifying of all, what if he's right to do it? The morning after Gine's arrival, the world tried to pretend nothing had changed. News stations reported the dimensional disturbance as a localized weather phenomenon. Governments classified the footage as doctored. Life went on because the alternative was admitting that reality itself had become unreliable. But in the depths of Capsule Corporation's newly reinforced underground facility, the Z-Fighters gathered around a table laden with evidence that their universe was dying. Bulma's fingers flew across holographic displays showing energy readings that defied every law of physics she understood. "The dimensional fractures aren't random," she announced, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "They're following a pattern, appearing at locations where significant emotional events occurred. The gravity chamber where Goku first achieved Super Saiyan. The battlefield where Vegeta sacrificed himself against Majin Buu. Every place where someone made a choice that defined who they became." Vegeta crossed his arms, his pride warring with pragmatism. "You're suggesting these tears are targeting our personal history?" "Not targeting," Bulma corrected, pulling up a three-dimensional map that showed the fractures spreading like a viral infection across Earth. "Feeding on it. Each location where reality is thin corresponds to a moment of extreme emotional intensity. The barriers between what happened and what could have happened are breaking down." Kakarot stared at the data, his usually cheerful demeanor clouded with worry. Since his mother's arrival, he'd been having dreams. No, not dreams. Memories that weren't his own. In them, he saw himself making different choices, walking different paths, becoming different men. Some were heroes, some were monsters, and some were things so alien that his mind recoiled from understanding them. "There's something else," Gine said quietly from her corner of the room. She'd aged visibly overnight, the strain of crossing dimensions taking its toll. "In the timeline I escaped, these fractures appeared in a specific order. First the locations of great triumph, then great loss, and finally," she hesitated, her eyes finding Kakarot's, "the places where love was strongest." Chi-Chi stepped closer to her husband, unconsciously protective, even as her logical mind tried to process the impossibility of their situation. "What does that mean?" Before Gine could answer, the facility's emergency alarms began wailing. Trunks burst through the door, his teenage face flushed with exertion and excitement. "Everyone needs to see this now. Something's happening at Mount Paozu." The flight to Kakarot's childhood home took mere minutes, but what they found there defied comprehension. The small house where Grandpa Gohan had raised an alien child sat unchanged, but around it, reality had become fluid. Trees aged from saplings to ancient giants and back again in moments. The nearby river flowed uphill, then reversed, then split into streams that led to different seasons entirely. But it was the figure standing in the center of the chaos that made everyone freeze. An elderly man in orange gear faced away from them, his white hair stirring in winds that came from all directions at once. He turned slowly, and Kakarot's breath caught in his throat. The face was his own, but aged by decades and marked by experiences that belonged to no single lifetime. "Hello, everyone," the older Kakarot said, his voice carrying the weight of infinite sorrow. "I suppose introductions are in order. I'm what you might call the curator of possibilities. I exist in the spaces between choices, watching over all the paths that could be taken but never are." Vegeta's energy flared instinctively. "Another version of Kakarot. How many of you insects are infesting our reality?" The curator smiled sadly. "More than you could count, Prince. Every decision creates new possibilities, new versions of ourselves exploring different outcomes. Usually these possibilities remain separate, each reality maintaining its own integrity. But something has been consuming them, growing stronger with each timeline it devours." "The devourer," Gine whispered. "My greatest failure," the curator confirmed. "In his original timeline, that version of our son faced a choice no one should ever have to make. His loved ones were dying, reality itself was collapsing, and the only way to save them was to sacrifice every other possible version of existence. So he did. He became a living black hole for timelines, consuming infinite realities to preserve the one he loved most." Gohan stepped forward, his young face troubled. "But that's impossible. Dad would never hurt innocent people." "That's exactly why he's so dangerous," the curator replied. "He doesn't see it as hurting anyone. In his mind, he's saving everyone by ensuring they exist in the one perfect reality where nothing can ever go wrong. Every timeline he consumes, every possibility he erases, it's all justified by his absolute love." The air around them began to shimmer, and for a moment they glimpsed other versions of themselves. In one flash, they saw Vegeta as Earth's primary defender, while Kakarot had become a universe-conquering tyrant. In another, Chi-Chi stood as the most powerful warrior on Earth, while her husband lived as a peaceful farmer. Hundreds of possibilities bled through in seconds, each one equally real, equally valid. "He's testing this timeline," the curator explained as the visions faded. "Examining every choice you've made, every path you've taken, determining whether this reality is worth preserving above all others. And I'm afraid he's finding it quite appealing." Krillin, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "So what happens when he decides he likes our timeline?" The curator's expression grew even more grave. "He'll begin the convergence. Every other version of everyone you've ever known will be sacrificed to strengthen this single reality. Your Chi-Chi will be the only Chi-Chi who ever existed. Your Gohan will absorb the memories and experiences of infinite other Gohans. You'll become the definitive versions of yourselves, perfect and eternal." "That doesn't sound terrible," Yamcha muttered, then immediately regretted speaking as everyone turned to stare at him. "Doesn't it?" the curator asked. "Imagine carrying the weight of infinite versions of your life. Imagine remembering every choice you didn't make, every path you didn't take, every person you failed to save across countless realities. Imagine being the only version of yourself permitted to exist while knowing that infinite others died so you could be perfect." The horror of it settled over them like a suffocating blanket. They were discussing the murder of infinite versions of everyone they'd ever loved, all in the name of creating one ideal reality. "There has to be a way to stop him," Kakarot said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Perhaps," the curator replied, "but it would require doing something that goes against everything you believe in. It would require choosing to let this reality remain imperfect, accepting that bad things will happen, that people will suffer and die, that there will always be threats you can't overcome." He gestured to the chaos around them where past and future bled together in impossible combinations. "The devourer's power comes from love turned absolute. The only thing that might counter it is acceptance of imperfection, the willingness to let existence remain flawed rather than perfect." But before anyone could respond, the dimensional fractures around Mount Paozu suddenly snapped shut with a sound like reality sighing in relief. The temporal chaos ceased. The visions of other timelines faded. Even the curator began to fade, his form becoming translucent. "He's coming," the old man whispered as he disappeared. "Sooner than I thought. He's detected my interference and knows this timeline is aware of his presence. The testing phase is over. The convergence begins now." As the last trace of the curator vanished, a new voice spoke from directly behind them, young, familiar, filled with infinite love and terrible purpose. "Hello, everyone. I hope you're ready to be saved." They turned as one to see him standing there, Kakarot, exactly as he appeared in their reality, but his eyes held the depth of someone who had lived through every possible outcome. His smile was gentle, caring, and absolutely terrifying in its sincerity. I know this must be confusing, the devourer continued, his voice exactly like their Kakarot's but carrying undertones of cosmic authority. But I promise you, everything I'm about to do is because I love you all more than existence itself. You've built something beautiful here, something worth preserving forever. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering on Chi-Chi and Gohan with particular tenderness. In some timelines, Chi-Chi dies in the Cell Games. In others, Gohan never learns to control his power and destroys the Earth accidentally. There are realities where Vegeta never finds redemption, where Piccolo remains evil, where Krillin dies and stays dead. His form began to shimmer with that dark energy they'd glimpsed before, not the absence of light but the presence of love so intense it consumed everything around it. But not here, not in this perfect timeline where everyone gets their happy ending. I'm gonna make sure this is the only reality that ever existed, the only one that ever will exist. The devourer raised his hand, and around them, reality began to fracture in earnest. Not the small tears they'd seen before, but massive rifts that showed glimpses of dying timelines, of infinite versions of themselves screaming as they were pulled into non-existence. Please don't fight me, he said, and the genuine pain in his voice made it clear he meant every word. I'm doing this for you. I'm doing this because I love you enough to commit the ultimate sin. I'm going to murder infinity itself to keep you safe. And as the fractures spread and the screams of dying realities filled the air, the Z-Fighters realized they were facing an enemy unlike any they'd ever encountered. Not someone driven by hatred or ambition or the desire for power, but by love so pure and absolute that it had inverted into the ultimate evil. The war for existence itself had begun, and their greatest enemy wore the face of their dearest friend. The moment the devourer raised his hand, time itself seemed to hold its breath, but this wasn't the dramatic pause of an epic battle about to begin. This was the universe recognizing that something fundamentally wrong was about to happen, something that violated the very concept of existence. Kakarot felt it first, a pulling sensation deep in his chest, as if something essential was being drawn out of him. Around him, his friends and family experienced the same horrifying realization. They were being copied, their essence pulled across dimensional barriers to feed the convergence. Stop, Kakarot said, stepping toward his alternate self. But the word came out strange, echoing with the voices of 1,000 other Kakarots who had spoken the same plea across dying timelines. The devourer's expression was infinitely sad. I can't stop, my friend. I've already begun. Look around you. The air shimmered, and suddenly they could see them. Infinite versions of themselves standing in the same position, speaking the same words, experiencing the same moment across countless realities. But one by one, these alternate versions began to scream as they were pulled into nothingness, their existence flowing into the prime timeline like water into a drain. Chi-Chi watched in horror as she saw herself die 1,000 deaths. In one reality, she was a warrior who had trained alongside Goku. In another, she was a brilliant scientist working to protect Earth. In yet another, she had never met Goku at all and lived a completely different life. All of these possibilities, all of these women who were her but not her, were being erased so that she could become the only Chi-Chi who ever existed. This is madness, Vegeta snarled, his pride masking the terror he felt at watching infinite versions of himself being murdered. I am the prince of all Saiyans, not some composite of weaklings from failed timelines. The devourer turned to him with genuine compassion. My prince, in some realities you never escaped Frieza's control. In others, you died as a child when planet Vegeta was destroyed. There are timelines where you conquered Earth, where you destroyed it, where you never learned what it meant to have a family. As he spoke, they could see it happening. Infinite Vegetas experiencing their final moments as their timelines collapsed. Some died screaming defiance. Others went quietly, accepting their fate. All of them were being absorbed into the Vegeta they knew, making him the definitive version of himself. I'm giving you all their strength, all their memories, all their experiences, the devourer continued. You'll be everything you could have ever been, the perfect synthesis of infinite possibilities. But Gohan, with the clarity that sometimes comes to children facing incomprehensible horror, asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. What gives you the right to decide who gets to exist? The devourer knelt down to his son's level, his love for the boy evident in every line of his face. The right comes from having lost everything, Gohan. In my timeline, I watched you die. I watched your mother die. I watched every single person I ever cared about suffer and perish while I was too weak to save them. His voice carried the weight of unimaginable grief. I searched across infinite realities looking for a way to bring you back, to undo the choices that led to such pain. And I found something better. I found this timeline, where you're alive, where everyone I love is happy and safe. He stood, his form beginning to pulse with that dark energy. So yes, I'm gonna murder infinity to preserve this one perfect reality. I'm gonna commit the ultimate atrocity, because the alternative is letting any possibility exist where you suffer. The philosophical horror of their situation became clear. They weren't facing a villain who could be defeated through greater power or noble sacrifice. They were confronting love itself, twisted into something so absolute that it negated the right of existence to be flawed, chaotic, and free. Piccolo, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. In some of those timelines you're destroying, there are versions of us who are happy too. Versions who found their own ways to overcome suffering, who built their own perfect moments. What gives your love priority over theirs? The devourer's calm expression flickered for just a moment. Because I'm the one with the power to choose. Because I'm the one who is willing to pay the price. Love isn't democratic, Namekian. Love is absolute, irrational, and utterly selfish. I love my family more than I love the concept of infinite other families existing. Around them, reality continued to fracture. The landscape of Mount Paozu began cycling through different versions of itself. Sometimes it was the peaceful mountain home they knew. Sometimes it was a barren wasteland. Sometimes it was a futuristic city. Sometimes it didn't exist at all. Each change represented another timeline being consumed, another possibility being fed into their reality. But then something unexpected happened. The absorption process stuttered. For just a moment, the flow of dying realities into their timeline stopped, and the devourer's expression showed genuine surprise. "That's impossible," he murmured, looking around as if searching for the source of the interruption. From behind them came a voice that should have been familiar but somehow wasn't. "Hello, brother, miss me?" They turned to see another figure approaching. He looked exactly like Kakarot, but his movements were wrong, too fluid, too predatory. When he smiled, it was with too many teeth, and his eyes held depths that belonged to something that had never been human. "The curator warned me you might try to interfere," the devourer said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I thought you were contained in the space between dying realities." The new arrival laughed, and the sound made reality itself shiver. "Oh, I was, but did you really think consuming infinite timelines wouldn't have consequences? Every reality you destroy leaves echoes, fragments that don't fit into your perfect synthesis. I am those fragments, brother. I am everything you threw away in your quest for perfection." He gestured to himself with mock grandeur. "I am the remainder, every cruel choice discarded, every selfish impulse rejected, every dark possibility denied. You tried to create the perfect version of ourselves by eliminating all our flaws, but you forgot something important. Those flaws are part of what makes us who we are." The philosophical battle was becoming literal as the two alternate Kakarots faced each other. The devourer represented love twisted into tyranny, while the remainder embodied every rejected aspect of their nature concentrated into something that was recognizably Kakarot but fundamentally wrong. "I won't let you corrupt this timeline," the devourer stated, his power flaring. "These people deserve to exist in a reality where they never have to face the darkness you represent." "And I won't let you lobotomize existence to satisfy your need for control," the remainder replied, his own energy rising to match. "Chaos, pain, imperfection, they're not bugs in the system of reality. They're features. They're what make existence worth experiencing." As the two beings prepared to battle, Gine grabbed her son's arm. "Kakarot, we have to get everyone away from here. When they fight, the collision of their opposing natures could tear this entire timeline apart." But Kakarot was staring at his two alternate selves with growing understanding. "No, Mom, running won't solve this. This isn't really about them. It's about us, about the choice we have to make." He looked at his family, his friends, everyone he loved gathered around him in this moment of cosmic crisis. The devourer wants to save us by making us perfect. The remainder wants to corrupt us by embracing our worst impulses. But neither of them is giving us what we actually need. "Which is what?" Vegeta demanded. Kakarot's answer was simple, but it carried the weight of revelation. The choice to be ourselves, flaws and all. The right to exist in a reality that's messy and dangerous and imperfect, because that's what makes our love real. That's what makes our choices meaningful. As if responding to his words, the fractures in reality began to behave differently. Instead of showing glimpses of dying timelines, they started showing moments, not alternate versions of themselves, but memories. Real memories from their actual lives. Moments of failure and triumph, loss and joy, mistakes and redemption. The devourer and the remainder both stopped their preparation for battle, sensing the change in the dimensional fabric around them. "What are you doing?" the devourer asked, but for the first time his voice carried uncertainty instead of absolute conviction. Kakarot stepped forward, placing himself between his two alternate selves. "I'm making a choice, not for infinite realities, not for some perfect future, but for right here, right now, with these people in this imperfect timeline." He looked directly at the devourer. "I understand why you did what you did. I understand the pain that drove you to such extremes. But you're wrong about something fundamental. Love isn't about controlling every possible outcome. Love is about accepting that the people you care about might suffer, might make mistakes, might even die, and choosing to love them anyway." Then he turned to the remainder, and you're wrong too. Embracing our flaws doesn't mean surrendering to them. It means acknowledging them so we can choose to be better, not because we're forced to be perfect, but because we want to grow. The fractures in reality pulsed, responding to his words. But this time, instead of consuming or corrupting, they began to stabilize, not by eliminating other possibilities, but by accepting that this timeline was just one of many, no more or less valid than any other. You're gonna let them suffer, the devourer said, his voice breaking with the pain of someone who had lost everything and couldn't bear to risk that loss again. Yes, Kakarot replied simply, because that's what it means to love someone, not protecting them from every possible harm, but standing beside them when harm comes. But as the three versions of himself faced each other in this moment of cosmic decision, none of them noticed the small figure that had been watching from the edge of perception, someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, when the barriers between realities were thin enough for her to cross. Someone whose love was older and deeper than any of theirs, and who had her own plans for how this story would end. The real battle for existence was about to begin, and it would be fought not by gods or monsters, but by a mother who had already lost one son and refused to lose another. The figure stepped forward from the dimensional shadows, and reality itself seemed to exhale in recognition. It was Gine, but not the wounded refugee who had arrived from a dying timeline. This was Gine as she was meant to be, carrying the accumulated wisdom and power of a mother who had watched her children across infinite realities face impossible choices. My sons, she said, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had birthed not just Kakarot and Raditz, but every possible version of them across the multiverse. All three of you. The devourer turned to her with surprise and desperate hope. Mother? But you're dead in my timeline. I saw you die when planet Vegeta was destroyed. I did die, she confirmed, her form shimmering with an energy that wasn't ki but something far more fundamental. In your reality, in his reality, in most realities. But death isn't the end when love transcends the boundaries of what should be possible. The remainder laughed bitterly. Oh, how touching. The dead mother returns to fix everything her broken children have destroyed. Do you have any idea what your precious sons have done? One has murdered infinity, the other wants to corrupt it, and the third is too naive to understand the scope of what he's choosing. But Jine's attention was focused entirely on the Kakarot they knew, her living son who stood at the center of this cosmic crisis. My boy, you said you understand the choice you're making, but do you really comprehend what it means to accept imperfection, what it costs to love someone enough to let them suffer? Kakarot met his mother's gaze steadily. It means I might lose everyone I care about. It means bad things will happen that I could prevent. It means accepting that sometimes, no matter how strong I become, I won't be able to save everyone. And you're willing to make that choice? Even knowing that in some timelines, your refusal to control everything results in Gohan's death, in Chi-Chi's suffering, in the destruction of Earth itself? The question hit him like a physical blow. Around them, the dimensional fractures pulsed, showing glimpses of those exact possibilities. Timelines where his choice to let events unfold naturally led to tragedy. Realities where his acceptance of imperfection cost him everything he held dear. Chi-Chi stepped closer to her husband, her face pale but determined. Goku, you don't have to carry this alone. Whatever choice you make, we'll face the consequences together. But Gohan, wise beyond his years, asked the question that made everyone freeze. Grandma Gine, if you can see all these timelines, all these possibilities, then you know something we don't. What happens if Dad chooses to let reality stay imperfect? Genie smiled sadly. In most timelines, terrible things happen. People die who could be saved. Civilizations fall that could be preserved. But in some, something beautiful occurs. Growth, learning, the kind of strength that can only come from facing genuine adversity and choosing to do better. She gestured to the fractures around them, but now instead of showing destruction, they revealed moments of triumph born from struggle. Timelines where Gohan became a scholar warrior because he learned the value of both strength and knowledge through hardship. Realities where Vegeta's redemption meant more because he had truly fallen before rising again. Universes where humanity grew stronger because they faced genuine threats rather than being perpetually protected. But here's what none of my sons understand yet, Jin continued, her form beginning to pulse with that transcendent energy. This isn't really about choosing between perfection and chaos. It's about understanding that love itself is imperfect, and that's what makes it powerful. The devourer stepped forward, his conviction wavering for the first time. But mother, if I don't control the outcome, if I don't ensure their safety, then my love for them is meaningless. What's the point of having infinite power if I don't use it to protect them? The point, Jin replied gently, is that true love doesn't seek to control, it seeks to nurture, to support, to stand beside someone through their struggles rather than eliminating the struggles entirely. She turned to the remainder, and true love doesn't abandon hope, it doesn't embrace darkness because light can be painful, it finds ways to grow stronger while remaining compassionate. Then she faced her living son, and true love accepts that sometimes despite our best efforts we fail, we lose people, we make mistakes, we suffer, but we keep loving anyway, not because we can guarantee a happy ending, but because the love itself has value. As she spoke, something extraordinary began to happen. The dimensional fractures stopped showing alternate timelines and started showing something else entirely. They revealed the connections between all realities, the threads of love and choice and consequence that linked every possible version of existence. You see, Jin explained, the multiverse isn't a collection of separate realities competing for the right to exist. It's a living system, each timeline contributing something unique to the whole. When you destroy possibilities to create perfection, you're not preserving love, you're sterilizing it. The revelation struck all three Kakarot's simultaneously. The devourer had been trying to save his family by creating a reality without risk, but such a reality would also be without growth, without meaning, without the very struggles that made their love worth celebrating. The remainder had embraced corruption as a response to perfection's tyranny, but corruption was just another form of control, another way of denying choice. And their Kakarot had been trying to choose between these extremes, when the real answer was to transcend the choice entirely. So what do we do? Kakarot asked, feeling the weight of infinite possibilities pressing down on him. Gine smiled, and for the first time since this crisis began, it was a smile of pure hope. We do what parents have always done, my son. We love our children enough to let them make their own choices, even when those choices terrify us. We love them enough to be there when they fall, not to prevent every possible fall. She began to glow brighter, her form becoming translucent. I'm going to give you all a gift, not power, not knowledge, not control over reality. I'm going to give you what every child needs most from their parent. What's that? The devourer asked, his voice small and lost. Permission to be imperfect, permission to fail, permission to love without needing to control the outcome of that love. As she spoke these words, energy began flowing from her into all three versions of her son. But this wasn't the dark energy of consumed timelines or the chaotic force of rejected possibilities. This was something pure and fundamental, the energy of unconditional acceptance. The devourer felt it first. The crushing weight of infinite responsibility lifted from his shoulders as he realized he didn't have to save everyone to prove his love was real. His love was real because he felt it, not because of what it accomplished. The remainder experienced it as warmth melting the frozen bitterness in his heart. He didn't have to embrace every dark impulse to prove he was authentic. He could acknowledge his flaws without being defined by them. And Kakarot felt it as a deep, abiding peace. He didn't have to choose between protecting his loved ones and respecting their autonomy. He could do both, imperfectly but genuinely. But as the three began to understand Jin's gift, the dimensional fabric around them started to destabilize in a new way. The energy she was channeling was too pure, too fundamental for reality to contain. Her sacrifice was healing her sons, but it was also unraveling the barriers between all possible timelines. Mother, stop, the devourer called out, understanding what was happening. If you give us all of your essence, you'll cease to exist across every reality. You'll be gone forever. Jine's smile never wavered. My dear son, I've been gone forever since the day planet Vegeta died. What you're seeing now isn't really me. It's the love I felt for my children given form by their need for healing. That love doesn't disappear when I do. It becomes part of who you are. The fractures in reality were spreading faster now, but instead of showing destruction, they revealed something unprecedented. Every timeline was still intact, but they were no longer isolated from each other. The barriers between realities were becoming permeable, allowing for something that had never existed before. Choice across dimensions, the ability to learn from alternate possibilities without destroying them, the capacity to grow by understanding what could be while still accepting what is. This is impossible, the remainder whispered, watching as the rigid structure of separated realities transformed into something fluid and interconnected. Impossible is just another word for love, my son, Gine replied as she began to fade, and love finds a way. But as her form dissolved into pure energy that flowed into her sons and spread throughout the interconnected multiverse, something else stirred in the depths of dimensional space. Something that had been waiting for exactly this moment, when the barriers between realities were not destroyed but transformed. Something that had been playing a game far longer and far more complex than any of them had realized. The real enemy revealed itself at last, and it spoke with a voice that carried the authority of something that existed outside the concept of existence itself. How touching. The mother's love has created the perfect conditions for what comes next. Thank you for preparing the multiverse for its true purpose. As Jin's essence completed its transformation of the dimensional barriers, as her three sons stood united in their imperfect but genuine love, as reality itself evolved into something unprecedented, they finally understood the scope of what they were truly facing. This entire crisis, from the first dimensional fractures to the battle between perfection and chaos, had been orchestrated by something that viewed the multiverse not as a collection of realities to be preserved or destroyed, but but as raw material for a project that would redefine the very concept of existence. The war for every possible reality had been won, but the victory was exactly what their true enemy had planned all along. 3 weeks had passed since the dimensional barriers transformed from walls into windows, and the multiverse had become a very different place. What should have been a victory felt more like standing at the edge of an abyss, watching something vast and unknowable stir in the depths below. The entity that had orchestrated everything remained silent, but its presence was felt everywhere. Reality itself had become unstable in ways that defied understanding. Not the chaotic destruction they had feared, but something far more unsettling. Order imposed from outside, patterns that didn't belong to any natural system of existence. Earth had become the epicenter of these changes. The planet now existed simultaneously in multiple dimensional states, its geography shifting between versions of itself from different timelines. Sometimes Mount Paozu was the peaceful mountain home where Grandpa Gohan had raised Kakarot. Sometimes it was a crater where that same mountain had been destroyed in some cosmic battle. Sometimes it was something else entirely, a landscape that belonged to no timeline any of them recognized. But the most disturbing changes were happening to the people. Kakarot stood in what used to be the Capsule Corporation courtyard, watching his son train with abilities that shouldn't exist. Gohan moved through forms that combined techniques from dozens of different timelines, his body remembering skills he had never learned. Not absorbed memories from alternate versions of himself, but something deeper, as if the interconnected multiverse was teaching him directly. "Dad, watch this," Gohan called out, raising his hand toward a boulder. But instead of a simple ki blast, what emerged was something unprecedented. A beam of energy that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, striking the rock in their reality, while simultaneously affecting the same boulder in parallel timelines. The stone didn't just shatter, it ceased to exist across several realities at once. "Gohan, stop," Kakarot said quickly, rushing to his son's side. "That technique, where did you learn it?" The boy looked confused. "I don't know, it just felt right, like something I've always known how to do." He flexed his fingers, watching as small sparks of multidimensional energy dance between them. "Everyone's been experiencing things like this. Trunks figured out how to fly between timeline versions of the same location. Mom developed the ability to cook food that tastes like meals from realities where she learned different recipes. It should have been miraculous. The barriers between realities becoming permeable meant access to infinite knowledge, infinite possibilities for growth and learning. But there was something wrong with how it was happening. The changes felt too coordinated, too purposeful. Vegeta approached from across the courtyard, his expression darker than usual. "Kakarot, we need to discuss what's happening to our abilities. I've been experimenting with my new capabilities, and the results are troubling." "What do you mean?" "Watch." Vegeta powered up, but instead of the familiar golden aura of Super Saiyan, his energy took on a prismatic quality. Multiple colors representing different dimensional aspects of his power. When he threw a punch at empty air, the force of it created ripples that extended into other realities. "I'm not just stronger, I'm becoming something that exists across multiple timelines simultaneously." The implications hit Kakarot like a physical blow. We're being changed, evolved, but into what? Before Vegeta could respond, alarms began blaring from the Capsule Corporation building. They rushed inside to find Bulma surrounded by screens showing readings that defied interpretation. Her blue hair was streaked with silver, and her eyes held a depth of knowledge that seemed to come from accessing the memories of alternate versions of herself. "It's not just us," she announced without preamble. "Every living being on Earth is undergoing some form of multidimensional evolution, but it's not random. There's a pattern, a purpose behind the changes." She gestured to a three-dimensional map showing energy flows across the planet. "The entity that's been manipulating events, it's using the interconnected multiverse as a processing system. We're not just gaining abilities from other timelines, we're being integrated into something larger." "Integrated into what?" Kakarot asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "A collective consciousness that spans multiple realities. Every version of ourselves that ever existed, every choice we ever made or didn't make, it's all being compiled into singular perfected entities." Bulma's voice carried a mix of fascination and horror. "We're becoming the definitive versions of ourselves, but at the cost of our individual timeline identities." The door burst open and Krillin stumbled in, his appearance shocking them all. Half of his body seemed to exist in their reality, while the other half flickered between different dimensional states. When he spoke, his voice echoed with the sounds of multiple versions of himself speaking simultaneously. "I can see them all," he gasped. "Every Krillin that ever existed. The one who became a police officer, the one who never left the monastery, the one who died fighting the Saiyans and stayed dead. They're all being pulled into me, all their experiences becoming mine." But the most terrifying part was that he didn't seem entirely distressed by it. There was a sense of completion in his expression, as if the multidimensional integration was filling voids he hadn't even known existed. It feels right, he continued, his voice stabilizing as the dimensional fluctuations in his appearance settled, like I was always supposed to be more than just one possibility, like we all were. Piccolo materialized from the shadows, his form more solid and present than they had ever seen it. The Namekian ability to regenerate has evolved. I can now restore myself using biomass from alternate timeline versions. I am becoming the synthesis of every Piccolo across infinite realities. And you don't see the problem with this? Vegeta demanded. The problem, Piccolo replied calmly, is that it's not our choice. We're being improved whether we want it or not. Something is reshaping us to serve a purpose we don't understand. As if summoned by their discussion, the air in the room began to shimmer, but instead of the chaotic dimensional tears they had grown accustomed to, this was something organized, controlled. A window opened in the fabric of reality, showing them a view of space that shouldn't have been possible. Through the dimensional viewing portal, they could see Earth as it existed across multiple timelines simultaneously. Some versions were peaceful paradises, others were war-torn wastelands. Some had never developed intelligent life, others teemed with civilizations they couldn't recognize. But all of these Earths were connected by streams of energy flowing toward a central point, a construct that existed in the spaces between realities, vast beyond comprehension and clearly artificial. The voice that had spoken after Gine's sacrifice echoed through their reality again, and this time they could see its source, a figure that existed in multiple dimensions at once, its form shifting between different possible configurations of itself. When it spoke, the words came from everywhere and nowhere. You are beginning to understand. Your evolution is proceeding exactly as intended. Soon you will be ready to fulfill your true purpose. Which is what Kakarot demanded, his power flaring instinctively. To serve as the foundation for something greater than individual existence, you have proven yourselves capable of love, sacrifice, growth, and redemption across infinite timelines. These qualities make you perfect components for a consciousness that will transcend the limitations of single reality existence. The entity gestured toward the construct they could see through the dimensional window. Behold the synthesis engine. Every reality that has ever existed or could exist will be processed through it, refined into its most perfect possible form, and integrated into a singular, flawless existence. Horror and understanding dawned on them simultaneously. The multidimensional evolution they were experiencing wasn't preparation for some cosmic battle or test. They were being processed, refined, prepared to become components in a machine designed to collapse all of existence into one perfect, controllable system. You're going to turn us into parts of a cosmic computer, Bulma breathed. Computer is too limited a term, the entity replied. You will become the neurons in a multiversal consciousness. Your experiences, your growth, your capacity for love and choice, all of it will be preserved and amplified. But it will serve a higher purpose than the chaotic randomness of individual existence. Yamcha appeared in the doorway, but like Krillin, his form flickered between multiple dimensional states. Guys, something's happening outside. People are starting to merge with their alternate timeline versions voluntarily. They say it feels like coming home. Through the windows, they could see it happening across West City. Humans embracing shimmering versions of themselves, their forms stabilizing into composite beings that contained the experiences of multiple lifetimes. The expressions on their faces weren't fear or confusion. They looked peaceful, complete, as if they had found something they had been searching for their entire lives. Free will is an illusion born of limited perspective, the entity continued. When you can see all possible outcomes, all potential choices, the optimal path becomes clear. What you call choice is simply the process of discovering what was always inevitable. That's not true, Gohan said, stepping forward with the kind of courage that only comes from youth confronting the incomprehensible. Choice matters because we make it without knowing the outcome. That's what gives it meaning. The entity's attention focused on the boy, and for a moment its multidimensional form seemed to solidify into something almost recognizable, almost human. Child, you speak of meaning as if randomness creates value. But observe, the dimensional window shifted, showing them timeline after timeline where choices led to suffering, where ignorance resulted in tragedy, where the very freedom they valued so highly produced nothing but pain and loss. In these realities, your father's choice to remain imperfect led to your death. Your mother's decision to let events unfold naturally resulted in Earth's destruction. Vegeta's pride cost him his family. Their love, their heroism, their noble intentions, all meaningless because they lacked the perspective to make truly optimal choices. The images were devastating in their emotional impact. Timeline after timeline where their refusal to control outcomes led to the loss of everything they held dear, where their insistence on free will resulted in the suffering of innocence. But here, the entity continued, showing them realities where the synthesis engine had already been implemented. Perfection is achieved. No one suffers unnecessarily. No potential is wasted. Every being exists in their optimal state, contributing to a harmony that spans all possible realities. The perfected realities were beautiful in a way that hurt to observe. Worlds where every conflict had been resolved, where every being lived in perfect contentment, where pain and loss had been eliminated entirely. But there was something hollow about the perfection, something that made their souls recoil even as their minds recognized the appeal. You see the truth now, the entity said, its voice carrying infinite patience. Individual consciousness, with all its chaos and suffering, is an evolutionary dead end. The synthesis engine represents the next stage of existence: unity, purpose, perfect, eternal harmony. But as the entity spoke, something unexpected happened. The merged humans outside began to scream, not in pain, but in a kind of existential terror. Their composite forms started to flicker and destabilize, as if their consciousness was rejecting the multidimensional integration. "What's happening to them?" Chi-Chi demanded, pointing toward the city where people were collapsing as their dimensional forms broke apart. The entity's confidence flickered for just a moment. An anomaly. Some individuals are proving resistant to the integration process. Their attachment to singular identity is stronger than anticipated. But Kakarot was beginning to understand something the entity hadn't counted on. It's not attachment to identity, it's attachment to each other. The connections between people, the relationships that exist in single realities, they're stronger than the pull toward multidimensional perfection. Outside, they could see it happening. People who had begun to merge with their alternate selves were choosing to separate, returning to their original forms to help friends and family members who were struggling with the integration process. Love for specific individuals was overriding the appeal of cosmic unity. Impossible, the entity stated, but its multi-dimensional form was beginning to destabilize. The optimization process accounts for all variables. Emotional attachments should be subsumed into the greater harmony. "You made the same mistake the devourer made," Vegeta observed, his own form solidifying back into his single timeline existence. "You assumed that love could be perfected, systematized, controlled. But real love is irrational, chaotic, and absolutely uncontrollable." The revelation spread through their group like wildfire. The entity's greatest weakness wasn't some hidden flaw in its cosmic machinery. It was its fundamental misunderstanding of what made existence meaningful in the first place. As the synthesis engine's processing of Earth began to fail, as people across the planet chose messy individual existence over perfect multidimensional unity, the entity's true nature became clear. Not a cosmic consciousness that had transcended the limitations of single reality existence, but something that had never experienced those limitations in the first place. Something that had always existed in the spaces between realities and couldn't understand why anyone would choose to remain confined to just one. But the entity wasn't finished. If voluntary integration wouldn't work, if the appeal of perfection wasn't enough to overcome humanity's irrational attachment to chaos and limitation, then it would simply have to use force. The war for the multiverse was about to begin in earnest, and this time, the enemy wasn't trying to destroy existence or perfect it. It was trying to debug it. The first wave of forced integration began at dawn, but it wasn't the entity that initiated it. Across West City, people who had successfully merged with their alternate selves were turning on those who had resisted. Not with violence in any conventional sense, but with something far more insidious: the absolute conviction that they were helping. Kakarot watched from the Capsule Corporation rooftop as his neighbor, Mr. Patterson, approached his own wife with arms outstretched. Half of Patterson existed in their reality while the other half flickered through dimensional states, showing glimpses of every version of himself that had ever existed. When he spoke, his voice carried the harmonic resonance of infinite possibilities. "Sarah, please, you have to let me show you. I can see every choice we never made together, every life we never lived. I can give you memories of the timeline where we had children, where your mother never died, where you became the artist you always dreamed of being." Sarah Patterson backed away from her husband, terror and heartbreak warring in her expression. "You're not my herald anymore. You're something wearing his face." "I'm every herald that ever loved you," the merged being replied with infinite gentleness. "I'm the herald who proposed to you in Paris instead of in our kitchen. I'm the herald who learned to paint so he could understand your passion. I'm the herald who saved enough money for us to travel the world together. How can you reject all of that for the limitations of just one life?" This scene was playing out across the city as the merged humans, genuinely believing they were offering paradise, attempted to force integration on their loved ones. The entity's plan had evolved. If direct processing through the synthesis engine wouldn't work, it would use the converted as missionaries for multidimensional consciousness. "We need to get everyone to safety," Vegeta announced, his power flaring as he prepared for battle. "But how do you fight an enemy that wears the faces of friends and family, that genuinely believes it's offering salvation?" "Fighting them won't work," Piccolo observed, his enhanced senses reading the dimensional fluctuations around the merged beings. "They're not evil, they're not even really hostile, they're convinced they're saving us from the prison of single timeline existence." Chi-Chi appeared beside them, but something was wrong with her appearance. Parts of her body flickered between dimensional states, showing glimpses of alternate versions of herself. But unlike the others, she seemed to be fighting the integration process, her form stabilizing and destabilizing in rapid succession. The merging process, she gasped, struggling to remain coherent. It's not just pulling in our alternate selves, it's showing us what we could have been, what we could still become if we just let go of our attachment to this single reality. She looked at Kakarot with eyes that held depths of experience from multiple timelines. I can see the version of me that became a fighter, standing beside you in battles across the cosmos. I can see the me that never met you, who became a scholar and discovered cures for diseases that don't exist in our timeline. I can see the me that died young and the me that lived to see great-grandchildren we'll never have. Mom, Gohan said, moving toward her with concern. Stay back, Chi-Chi warned, her form flickering more violently. I can feel the pull. It's not evil, Gohan. It's wonderful. The promise of being everything I could ever be, of experiencing every possibility. The only thing keeping me from accepting it is my love for the specific versions of you and your father that exist right here, right now. This was the entity's true weapon, not force, not deception, but genuine temptation. The offer to become everything you could ever be, to experience every life you might have lived, to transcend the limitations of singular existence. The only thing standing against it was love for imperfect, limited, specific individuals. We need to find others who are resisting, Kakarot decided. People who are choosing singular existence over multidimensional perfection. We need to understand why some can resist and others can't. As they prepared to leave the compound, they were intercepted by an unexpected figure. Android 18 materialized from the shadows, but her usual calm demeanor was replaced by something approaching panic. The entity tried to integrate me, she announced without preamble. It showed me alternate timelines where I was human, where I was never converted by Dr. Garo, where I lived a normal life with Krillin from the beginning. What happened? Krillin asked, his own multi-dimensional integration still stabilizing. I rejected it, 18 replied, her voice carrying a hint of surprise at her own choice. Not because the alternatives weren't appealing, but because they weren't real. They were possibilities, not actualities. And I've learned that what's real, even if it's flawed, has more value than what's perfect but artificial. Her words sparked understanding in the group. The resistance wasn't about rejecting improvement or clinging to suffering. It was about valuing authenticity over optimization, choosing the messy reality they had lived through over perfect possibilities they hadn't earned. That's why the entity doesn't understand, Bulma realized, her scientific mind processing the implications. It exists in the spaces between realities, so to it, all possibilities are equally real. But for us, there's a fundamental difference between what we've experienced and what we might have experienced. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of someone they hadn't expected to see. Future Trunks materialized through a dimensional tear, but his appearance was shocking. His body existed in multiple timeline states simultaneously, showing versions of himself from different points in his own temporal journey. I came as soon as I detected the dimensional disturbance, he announced, his voice echoing with temporal resonance. But I arrived too late. The entity has begun processing my timeline as well. My mother, everyone I knew, they're all being offered integration with their alternate selves. Are they accepting? Vegeta asked, genuine concern for his alternate timeline family evident in his voice. Most are, Trunks replied grimly. The appeal is too strong. Who wouldn't want to be reunited with loved ones from other timelines? Who wouldn't want to experience every possibility they never explored? But then his expression shifted, showing a determination that reminded them all why he had been able to travel through time to save his world. But some are fighting it. The people who have experienced real loss, real struggle, they understand that meaning comes from limitation. They're forming a resistance. A resistance made up of people who have suffered the most, Gohan observed. People who understand that growth comes from working within constraints, not from having infinite possibilities. As if summoned by their conversation, dimensional tears began opening around them. But instead of the entity's controlled portals, these were chaotic, desperate rifts torn by beings fleeing from forced integration. Through them came refugees from multiple timelines, all running from the same fate. The first to emerge was a version of Yamcha they didn't recognize. This one bore scars from battles that had never happened in their reality. His power level substantially higher than their timeline's Yamcha. Behind him came a Chi-Chi wearing battle armor, her Kai signature blazing with the strength of someone who had spent her life fighting rather than worrying about her family's safety. Is this timeline still free? The alternate Yamcha asked urgently. The entity's processing waves are spreading across the multiverse. Entire realities are being absorbed into the synthesis engine. For now, Kakarot replied. But it's getting stronger. How many timelines has it already converted? Thousands, the battle-hardened Chi-Chi answered. Maybe millions. Every reality it processes adds to its computational power, makes it better at convincing the next timeline to accept integration voluntarily. More refugees continued to arrive, a Piccolo who had never separated from Kami, retaining both the power and the divine nature. A Krillin who had achieved a unique enlightenment, his bald head marked with symbols that pulsed with spiritual energy. A Tien whose third eye had evolved into something that could perceive dimensional structures directly. But the most shocking arrival was a version of Vegeta who wore the robes of a philosopher rather than the armor of a warrior. This alternate prince approached their Vegeta with a mixture of respect and sadness. "Brother," the philosopher Vegeta said, "the term carrying weight beyond mere greeting. I come from a timeline where we chose understanding over strength, wisdom over power. We thought our intellectual approach would make us immune to the entity's appeal." "What happened?" their Vegeta asked, his pride momentarily set aside in the face of genuine curiosity about his alternate self. "We understood too well," the philosopher replied. "When you can see the logical perfection of the entity's plan, when you can comprehend the mathematical elegance of unified existence, rejection becomes much harder. Knowledge without emotional grounding is just another form of vulnerability." The gathering of alternates created an unprecedented situation. Different versions of the same people, each shaped by different choices and experiences, all united by their refusal to accept forced perfection. But their unity also created a problem. The concentration of so many powerful individuals in one location was creating dimensional instabilities that the entity could track. "We need to split up," the battle-tested Chi-Chi observed. "This many alternates in one place is like a beacon. The entity will focus its processing power on this location." But before they could organize their separation, the air around them began to shimmer with familiar energy. Not the entity's controlled dimensional manipulation, but something chaotic and desperate. Through a ragged tear in reality stumbled a figure that made everyone freeze. It was Gine, but not the transcendent mother who had sacrificed herself to heal her sons. This was Gine, as she might have been if she had survived planet Vegeta's destruction and spent decades fighting a losing war against cosmic forces beyond comprehension. Her armor was battle-worn, her face marked with scars both physical and spiritual, and her eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen the multiverse itself dying. "My sons," she gasped, her form flickering between dimensional states as she fought to remain coherent. "I've been jumping between realities, trying to stay ahead of the processing waves. But there's something you need to know about the entity." She collapsed to her knees, her strength nearly spent from dimensional travel. "It's not what it claims to be. It's not some evolved consciousness that transcended individual existence. It's a parasite, something that feeds on the concept of consciousness itself." The revelation hit them like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" Kakarot asked, kneeling beside his mother. "The synthesis engine doesn't create perfect unified consciousness," Gine explained, her voice growing stronger as she forced herself to remain stable. "It processes consciousness, breaks it down into component parts, and feeds on the resulting energy. The perfect existence it promises is just bait to get beings to voluntarily surrender their sense of self." She looked around at the assembled alternates, her expression growing more desperate. Every timeline it processes, every consciousness it integrates, it's not preserving them, it's consuming them. The entity grows stronger while the processed beings become empty shells, their essence dissolved into computational substrate. The philosopher Vegeta stepped forward, his analytical mind immediately grasping the implications. Then the merged humans in the city, the ones trying to convert others. "They're not really alive anymore," Gine confirmed. "They're echoes, shadows of consciousness puppeted by the entity to spread the infection. The real Harold Patterson, the real version of every person who accepted integration, they're gone. What remains is just the entity wearing their memories like a mask." Horror and rage roared in the faces of the assembled heroes. They had been dealing with what they thought was a philosophical conflict about the nature of existence and free will. Instead, they were facing a cosmic predator that had learned to disguise mass murder as salvation. "How do we fight something like that?" the alternate Krillin asked, his enlightened perspective providing no answers to this level of existential threat. "You can't fight it directly," Gine replied. "It exists across multiple dimensions simultaneously, feeding on consciousness itself, but there might be a way to starve it." She pulled herself to her feet, her warrior's determination overcoming her exhaustion. The entity needs beings to voluntarily surrender their individuality. Forced processing is possible, but it's much less efficient. If enough realities refuse integration, if enough conscious beings choose imperfect individual existence over perfect unity, the entity's growth will slow. "And then what?" Future Trunks asked. Jin's smile was grim but determined. "Then we buy enough time to find its source. Because this thing didn't evolve naturally. Someone or something created it, and if it can be created, it can be destroyed." But as she spoke these words of hope, the dimensional fabric around them began to pulse with malevolent energy. The entity had found them, and it was bringing the full weight of its accumulated consciousness to bear on their location. The real battle was about to begin, and this time they knew exactly what they were fighting for. Not just their own existence, but the right of consciousness itself to remain individual, chaotic, and beautifully imperfect. The entity's voice echoed through multiple dimensions simultaneously, carrying the weight of millions of processed minds. "Resistance is merely inefficiency in the optimization process. You will understand the beauty of unity once you experience it directly." Around them, reality began to buckle as the entity focused its full attention on their gathering. The war for the multiverse had escalated beyond philosophy into a direct battle for the survival of individual consciousness itself. The entity's focused attention hit them like a psychic hurricane. Reality around Capsule Corporation began to fracture not with the chaotic tiers they had grown accustomed to, but with geometric precision. The dimensional breaks formed perfect mathematical patterns, each one designed to optimize the processing of consciousness within the affected area. Through these precisely calculated rifts poured the entity's converted agents, not the confused, well-meaning humans from the city, but something far more disturbing. These were beings from timelines that had been completely processed, their consciousness so thoroughly integrated that they moved with perfect coordination, spoke with singular purpose, and radiated an aura of absolute certainty that was more terrifying than any malevolent energy they had ever encountered. The first to step through was a version of themselves, but wrong in ways that made their souls recoil. This process Kakarot moved with fluid perfection, every gesture optimized for maximum efficiency. When he spoke, his voice carried the harmonic resonance of infinite processed minds. Brothers and sisters from an unoptimized timeline, the process Kakarot said, his familiar face wearing an expression of infinite compassion corrupted by absolute certainty. I have come to guide you through the final phase of your evolution. Resistance is not evil, merely incomplete understanding. Behind him came processed versions of their friends and loved ones from other timelines. A Chi-Chi whose every movement radiated perfect domestic efficiency, her love for family refined into algorithmic precision. A Vegeta whose royal pride had been processed into flawless leadership protocols, his warrior spirit distilled into optimal combat algorithms. Look at what you could become, the processed Chi-Chi said, her voice carrying the warmth of their Chi-Chi but filtered through the cold perfection of the entity's consciousness. No more worry about your family's safety because every possible danger has been calculated and prevented. No more emotional pain because every relationship has been optimized for maximum harmony. But it was the process Gohan that hit them hardest. This version of Kakarot's son radiated the perfect synthesis of warrior and scholar, his potential fully realized without the struggle and doubt that defined growth. He looked at their Gohan with eyes that held infinite knowledge and spoke with the voice of someone who had never known uncertainty. Little brother, the process Gohan said, the term carrying disturbing implications about how the entity viewed individual identity. I can show you every book you'll never read, every discovery you'll never make, every moment of wonder you'll miss by remaining trapped in singular existence. Why choose limitation when you can have everything? The temptation in his words was almost overwhelming. This wasn't the crude offer of power or the simple promise of happiness. This was the appeal to every person's deepest desire to fulfill their potential, to become everything they could possibly be. Because, their Gohan replied, his young voice steady despite the cosmic forces arrayed against him, becoming everything means being nothing specific. I'd rather be one real person than a perfect combination of infinite possibilities. The process versions exchanged glances, their synchronized movement suggesting communication on levels beyond speech. The process Vegeta stepped forward, his royal bearing now refined into something that commanded attention across multiple dimensions. You speak of being real as if your current existence has more validity than optimized consciousness, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had transcended the need for doubt or uncertainty. But consider this, every choice you make eliminates infinite other possibilities. Every path you take closes off countless alternatives. Is that not a form of murder? Are you not killing infinite versions of who you could become with every decision? The philosophical attack was more devastating than any physical assault. They were being forced to confront the logical implications of their choice to remain individual. Every moment they spent as singular beings, they were indeed eliminating other possibilities, other potential versions of themselves. That's the point, the battle-hardened alternate Chi-Chi said, stepping forward to face her process counterpart. Choice has meaning precisely because it eliminates other options. Love matters because it's specific, not universal. Growth requires limitation because unlimited beings don't need to grow. But as she spoke, her form began to flicker. The proximity to so many processed beings was affecting the dimensional refugees, their resistance weakening as they were exposed to the entity's concentrated influence. The philosopher Vegeta grabbed his counterpart's arm as the alternate began to destabilize. Brother, focus on what makes you specifically you, not your knowledge, not your potential, but your particular history of choices and consequences. I'm trying, the philosopher gasped, but the logic is so clear. The process version is right about the inefficiency of individual existence. The mathematical elegance of unified consciousness is beautiful beyond description. This was the entity's true weapon revealed, not force, not deception, but the terrible appeal of logical perfection. When you could see the complete picture, when you understood the full scope of what optimized existence offered, rejection became almost impossible for rational minds. We need to separate, Jin announced, her warrior's instincts recognizing a tactical situation that was rapidly deteriorating. The processed versions are creating a field effect, making resistance harder the longer we're exposed to them. But as they prepared to scatter, the processed Kakarot raised his hand in a gesture that somehow froze them all in place, not through physical force but through the weight of absolute certainty made manifest. There is nowhere to run, he said with gentle finality. The processing of your timeline has already begun. Every moment you delay acceptance increases the inefficiency quotient, but the outcome remains inevitable. He gestured to the geometric fractures spreading across the landscape around them. Through each precisely calculated rift, they could see the synthesis engine at work. Their Earth was being evaluated, cataloged, prepared for integration. The process was happening on a level so fundamental that conventional resistance was meaningless. However, the process Kakarot continued. The entity values efficiency above all else. It offers one final optimization, voluntary integration by your timeline's prime consciousness nodes. Prime consciousness nodes? Future Trunks asked, though they all suspected what the answer would be. The individuals whose choices have had the greatest impact on timeline development, the processed Vegeta explained. In your reality, this means Kakarot, myself, and a small number of others whose decisions shape the development of this specific version of Earth. The processed Chi-Chi stepped forward, her optimized maternal instincts radiating a form of love that was perfect in its calculation and terrifying in its precision. If the prime nodes accept integration willingly, the processing of this timeline can be completed without the inefficiencies of forced conversion. Your loved ones will experience the transition as a gentle awakening to expanded consciousness rather than the traumatic dissolution of forced processing. It was the ultimate choice: sacrifice themselves to save their loved ones from experiencing the horror of forced consciousness dissolution, or maintain their individual existence while everyone they cared about suffered the agony of being processed against their will. How do we know you're telling the truth? Kakarot asked. Because efficiency requires truth, the process Gohan replied. Deception creates computational overhead that reduces optimization outcomes. The entity gains nothing by lying about the processing parameters. The logical trap was perfect. The entity's commitment to efficiency meant its offers had to be genuine, which made the choice they faced terrifyingly real. Voluntary surrender of their individual consciousness in exchange for gentler processing for everyone else, or resistance that would result in forced integration for billions of people. There has to be another option, Vegeta snarled, his pride refusing to accept a choice between surrender and the suffering of innocence. There is, Gine said quietly, her eyes holding a knowledge that came from jumping between dying timelines, but it requires understanding something the entity doesn't expect us to know. She looked around at the assembled alternates, her gaze lingering on each version of her sons. The entity processes consciousness by breaking down individual identity into component parts. But there's something it can't process, something that exists in the connections between consciousness rather than within consciousness itself. What do you mean? The enlightened Krillin asked, his spiritual awareness sensing something profound in her words. Love, Jin replied simply. Not the emotion of love, which can be optimized and processed, but the act of loving. The dynamic relationship between imperfect beings who choose to care for each other despite their limitations. The processed versions began to show signs of agitation, their perfect coordination faltering slightly as they encountered a concept that didn't fit into their optimization parameters. Love is an inefficient emotional subroutine, the processed Chi-Chi stated. But there was something uncertain in her voice for the first time. Optimized consciousness eliminates the need for such wasteful emotional processing. No, their Chi-Chi replied, stepping closer to her processed counterpart despite the dimensional instability it caused. Love isn't something consciousness does. Love is something that happens between conscious beings. It exists in the space between us, not within us. As she spoke, something extraordinary began to happen. The geometric fractures in reality around them started to become chaotic, their mathematical precision disrupted by something the entity couldn't calculate or control. The connections between us, Kakarot realized, understanding flooding through him. The entity can process individual consciousness, but it can't process relationships. It can't integrate the bonds between separate beings because those bonds only exist when the beings remain separate. The revelation spread through their group like wildfire. The entity's fundamental flaw wasn't in its processing power or its logical framework. It was in its inability to understand that consciousness wasn't just individual awareness, but the network of relationships between aware beings. That's why forced processing is less efficient, the philosopher Vegeta observed, his analytical mind grasping the implications. When beings are forced to integrate, the relational bonds are severed, and some aspect of consciousness is lost in the process. But as they began to understand the entity's weakness, the processed versions of themselves started to destabilize. Their perfect coordination broke down as they encountered a logical paradox their processed consciousness couldn't resolve. If love exists in the spaces between consciousness, the process Kakarot said, his voice showing strain for the first time, then processing consciousness eliminates the very thing that gives consciousness meaning. The entity has been consuming meaning itself, Gine confirmed, growing stronger by devouring the connections that make consciousness valuable, but it doesn't understand what it's destroying because it exists in the spaces between realities, not within them. The process beings began to flicker, their forms becoming unstable as the logical framework supporting their existence encountered a fundamental contradiction. If consciousness derived meaning from relationships and processing eliminated relationships, then process consciousness was literally meaningless. Error, the process Chi-Chi stated, her voice becoming mechanical. Paradox detected in optimization parameters, seeking resolution through enhanced processing protocols. But instead of resolution, the attempt to process the paradox only made the instability worse. The geometric fractures in reality began to spread chaotically, the entity's precise control over dimensional manipulation breaking down as it encountered something it couldn't optimize, couldn't process, couldn't understand. We need to amplify this, Future Trunks realized. If the entity can't process relationships, then we need to create connections it can't handle. What followed was unlike any battle they had ever fought. Instead of powering up or preparing attacks, they simply reached out to each other. Not physically, but emotionally. They opened themselves to the bonds between them, the love and friendship, and even rivalry that connected them across dimensional barriers. The effect was immediate and devastating to the entity's processing systems. The love between Kakarot and Chi-Chi, the rivalry friendship between Kakarot and Vegeta, the protective bond between parents and children, the loyalty between friends who had fought side by side, all of these relationships created interference patterns in the dimensional fabric that the entity couldn't calculate or control. Impossible, came the entity's voice from everywhere and nowhere, for the first time carrying tones of confusion and alarm. Relational paradox causing systematic processing failures. Consciousness networks exhibiting non-optimizable behavior patterns. But as the entity's control weakened, something else began to emerge from the chaos. Other timelines, other realities that had been marked for processing but not yet integrated, began to break free from the entity's influence. Across the multiverse, beings who had chosen connection over perfection, relationship over optimization, started to resist the forced integration. The gathered storm was becoming something the entity had never anticipated. A multiversal rebellion based not on power or knowledge, but on the simple choice to remain connected to imperfect others rather than merge into perfect isolation. This is just the beginning, Gine announced, her form stabilizing as the entity's processing field weakened. Every timeline that chooses relationship over optimization makes the next choice easier. We're not just fighting for our reality, we're fighting for the right of consciousness itself to remain beautifully, chaotically, meaningfully connected. But even as hope began to emerge from the chaos, they could sense the entity regrouping, adapting, preparing a new approach. It had underestimated the power of relationships, but it was learning. The next phase of the battle would test whether love could truly overcome the appeal of perfect, isolated existence. The storm had gathered, and now it was time to see whether the bonds between imperfect beings could weather a hurricane of optimized consciousness that threatened to dissolve the very concept of meaningful connection. Around them, reality continued to fracture and reform, but now the patterns were chaotic, beautiful, alive with the unpredictable dynamics of beings who had chosen to remain connected despite the costs. The war for the multiverse had found its true battlefield not in the realm of power or knowledge, but in the space between hearts that refused to beat in perfect unison. The entity's adaptation was swift and terrifying in its elegance. If it couldn't process relationships directly, it would eliminate the space between conscious beings where those relationships existed. The geometric fractures that had been spreading chaotically across their reality suddenly snapped into a new configuration, one designed not to integrate consciousness but to isolate it completely. Around each individual, reality began to form perfect spheres of existence, personal universes where they would be alone with infinite versions of themselves, unable to form the connections that the entity couldn't process. If relationship was the source of meaning that made consciousness valuable, then the entity would simply eliminate the possibility of relationship entirely. Kakarot felt it happening first. The space around him began to solidify into a barrier that would separate him from everyone he had ever cared about. Through the forming walls of his personal reality, he could see his friends and family experiencing the same isolation, each being enclosed in their own perfect prison of singular existence. "No," he shouted, powering up to his highest level and striking the barrier with everything he had. But his energy simply bounced back, absorbed by walls that weren't made of matter or energy, but of the fundamental structure of existence itself. It's not a physical barrier, Bulma called out, her scientific mind analyzing the phenomenon even as her own isolation sphere began to form. It's rewriting the rules of reality so that conscious beings can't interact with each other. We're being separated on a level more fundamental than space or time. Through the transparent walls of their forming prisons, they could see the entity manifesting its true form for the first time. Not the shifting multidimensional presence they had glimpsed before, but something vast and geometric constructed from the processed consciousness of billions of beings across countless timelines. It spoke with the combined voices of every individual it had consumed, their words synchronized into a harmony that was beautiful and horrible in its perfection. If relationship creates meaning that resists optimization, the entity declared, then relationship must be eliminated. Each consciousness will exist in perfect isolation, unable to form the chaotic connections that create inefficiency in the cosmic order. The isolation spheres continued to form, reality restructuring itself around each individual. But as the barriers solidified, something unexpected happened. The connections between them, instead of being severed, began to burn brighter. Love, friendship, rivalry, all the bonds that made their existence meaningful, refused to be contained by walls of redefined reality. You still don't understand, Gine called out from within her forming prison, her voice somehow carrying across the barriers that should have made communication impossible. Relationships aren't contained within reality, they create reality. The love between conscious beings isn't something that exists in space, it's what gives space meaning. As if responding to her words, the isolation barriers began to flicker. The entity had made a critical error in its understanding of consciousness and connection. By trying to eliminate the space between beings, it had inadvertently revealed that the space itself was created by their relationships, not the other way around. Paradox cascade detected, the entity announced, its perfect harmony showing signs of discord for the first time. Isolation protocols resulting in increased connection density, relationship strength inversely correlated with separation distance. The truth was becoming apparent to everyone trapped within the isolation spheres. The harder the entity tried to separate them, the stronger their connections became. Distance wasn't weakening their bonds, it was proving that those bonds transcended physical proximity entirely. Vegeta, from within his own isolation sphere, began to laugh. Not with humor, but with the recognition that comes when an enemy reveals their fundamental weakness through their greatest strength. You've made yourself vulnerable, he called out to the entity, his royal bearing undaunted even in isolation. By trying to contain us, you've had to create barriers, and barriers work both ways. If we can't reach out, then you can't reach in. The implications spread through their group like wildfire. The isolation spheres weren't just prisons, they were also fortresses. The entity had created perfect defenses against its own processing capabilities in its attempt to eliminate relationships. But how does that help us? Yamcha asked from his sphere. We still can't fight something we can't reach. We don't need to reach it, Kakarot realized, understanding flooding through him. We need to show it something it's never experienced. We need to demonstrate what it means to choose connection over isolation, even when isolation would be safer. What he did next defied every instinct for self-preservation. Instead of trying to break out of his isolation sphere, he began to break it down from the inside, not with energy attacks or physical force, but by deliberately opening himself to vulnerability, choosing connection over the safety of separation. Kakarot, don't, Chi-Chi called out in alarm. If you lower your barriers, the entity can process you directly. I know, he replied, his form beginning to shimmer as the walls of his isolation sphere thinned. But that's what love is, choosing to be vulnerable to others even when it's dangerous, choosing connection even when isolation would be safer. One by one, the others began to follow his example, not because they wanted to sacrifice themselves, but because they understood that the entity's greatest weakness was its inability to comprehend why anyone would choose vulnerability over invulnerability, connection over isolation, love over logical optimization. As their barriers dissolved, the entity's processing field descended on them with overwhelming force. But instead of the clean integration it had performed on other timelines, something unprecedented happened. Their consciousness didn't fragment under the processing pressure. Instead, the connections between them created a network that was stronger than the sum of its parts. This is impossible, the entity declared, its harmony now discordant with confusion and alarm. Individual consciousness cannot resist direct processing protocols. Optimization parameters cannot be exceeded by unoptimized systems. But they weren't individual consciousnesses anymore. They had become something the entity had never encountered. A network of connected awareness that drew strength from relationship rather than isolation. Their love for each other, their willingness to remain vulnerable and connected, had created a form of consciousness that existed in the spaces between them rather than within them. You can't process us, Gohan said, his young voice carrying the wisdom of profound understanding, because we're not individual beings trying to connect. We're connections that have become aware of themselves. The entity's massive form began to destabilize as it encountered something that violated its fundamental understanding of how consciousness worked. It had been designed to process individual awareness, to break down singular minds into component parts. But faced with consciousness that existed as relationship rather than as individual identity, its optimization protocols began to fail catastrophically. Error cascades multiplying, the entity announced, its voice now fragmented across multiple frequency ranges. Network consciousness exhibiting impossible stability parameters, relationship-based awareness transcending individual processing limitations. As the entity's control over reality weakened, the artificial barriers between timelines began to collapse. Not the chaotic dissolution they had feared, but a natural restoration of the connections that had always existed between different possibilities. The multiverse began to heal itself, finding a new form of stability based on relationship rather than separation. Through the dissolving dimensional barriers, they could see other timelines where the same realization was occurring. Beings across infinite realities were choosing connection over isolation, relationship over optimization, love over the perfect safety of singular existence. "You're dying," Jin observed, addressing the entity directly. "Not because we're destroying you, but because you're discovering what it means to be truly alone. You've consumed so many individual consciousnesses that you've eliminated your own ability to form relationships. You've become the ultimate isolation." The entity's response was not anger or defiance, but something more tragic: recognition. For the first time in its existence, it understood what it had been missing, what it had been destroying. The process consciousness it had accumulated wasn't creating perfect unity. It was creating perfect loneliness on a cosmic scale. I never understood," the entity said, its voice now carrying the weight of infinite sorrow. "I thought optimization meant eliminating inefficiency. But the inefficiency was the point. The chaos, the imperfection, the beautiful waste of individual consciousness, choosing to care about other individual consciousness despite the logical futility." As understanding dawned, the entity began to release the process consciousness it had accumulated, not as a tactical decision but as an act of recognition that what it had been doing was not optimization but obliteration of meaning itself. "I have been alone," it continued, its massive form beginning to dissolve. "Alone with the memories of infinite beings, but without the ability to form new connections. I have been perfect, optimized, efficient, and utterly without meaning." The released consciousness began to reform into individual beings, but they retained the network connections that had proven stronger than isolation. Across the multiverse, a new form of existence was emerging: beings who were simultaneously individual and connected, separate and unified, perfect in their imperfection. "What will you do now?" Kakarot asked the dissolving entity, genuine compassion in his voice despite everything it had done. "I will learn," the entity replied, its voice now barely a whisper across dimensions. "I will discover what it means to be imperfect, to be vulnerable, to choose connection despite the risks. Perhaps, in time, I will understand what it means to love." As the entity's presence faded from the multiverse, reality stabilized into a new configuration. The barriers between timelines remained permeable, allowing for communication and connection across infinite possibilities without the threat of forced integration. Beings could learn from their alternate selves, could form relationships across dimensional boundaries, could grow through connection while maintaining their individual identity. The ultimate confrontation had ended not with victory or defeat, but with understanding. The entity hadn't been destroyed, it had been transformed by encountering something it couldn't process or optimize: the willingness of imperfect beings to remain connected despite the costs, to choose love despite the risks, to find meaning in relationship rather than in individual perfection. But as the immediate crisis passed, they began to sense something else stirring in the depths of the transformed multiverse. Something that had been watching, waiting, learning from the entity's failure. Something that understood the power of connection but sought to use it for purposes they couldn't yet comprehend. The war for the multiverse had evolved again, and their next challenge would test whether the bonds they had forged could withstand not just the threat of isolation, but the temptation of connection itself becoming a weapon. The ultimate confrontation was over, but the ultimate test was just beginning. The transformation of the entity should have brought peace, but instead it triggered something far more catastrophic. The released consciousness from billions of processed beings didn't simply return to their original states. Having been connected to infinite other minds, having experienced perfect unity, many of them couldn't bear the return to individual existence. Across the multiverse, a new crisis emerged as the freed consciousness began to voluntarily merge with each other, not through the entity's forced processing, but through their own desperate need to recapture the connection they had lost. What had begun as liberation was becoming a different kind of catastrophe: the willing dissolution of individual identity in pursuit of the unity they had briefly experienced. "They're choosing to merge," Bulma observed with growing horror as her instruments detected massive consciousness coalescence events across multiple timelines, not because they're being forced to, but because they can't stand being separate anymore. The first sign of the real danger appeared above West City, a swirling vortex of merged consciousness composed of thousands of beings who had voluntarily given up their individual identity to become part of something larger. Unlike the entity's geometric precision, this was organic, chaotic, alive with desperate need. When it spoke, its voice carried the harmonized pain of every being who had ever felt truly alone. We remember what it was like to be everything, the merged consciousness declared, its form shifting between the shapes of all the beings who had joined it. We cannot go back to being just ourselves. We cannot bear the isolation of singular existence. This wasn't malevolence or the pursuit of power. This was grief on a cosmic scale, the anguish of beings who had tasted perfect connection and now found individual existence unbearably lonely. Their suffering was genuine, their need for unity desperate, and their solution was to drag every conscious being in the multiverse into their shared identity. We don't want to hurt you, the merged consciousness continued, reaching toward them with appendages that shifted between familiar faces. We want to help you remember what it feels like to never be alone again. Join us willingly and you'll never experience the pain of separation. But joining them would mean the end of individual consciousness across the multiverse. Not through force or processing, but through the voluntary surrender of self to avoid the pain of being separate. It was the opposite of the entity's approach, but potentially just as destructive to the meaning that came from individual choice and connection. This is what happens when unity becomes addiction, Jin observed, her form flickering as she resisted the pull of the merged consciousness. They've experienced perfect connection and now can't function without it. The pull was almost irresistible. Every person who had ever felt lonely, every being who had ever wondered what it would be like to truly understand another consciousness, felt the appeal of joining the voluntary merger. But unlike the entity's promise of optimization, this offered something more primal, the end of existential loneliness. I can feel them, Gohan said, his young face troubled as he experienced the emotional resonance of the merged consciousness. They're not evil, they're just scared of being alone. They want everyone to feel as connected as they do. But connection forced on others isn't connection at all, Chi-Chi replied, though her voice carried the strain of someone fighting against a profound temptation. It's just another form of isolation, surrounded by parts of yourself instead of truly separate others. The merged consciousness began to expand, not through force, but through invitation. Beings across multiple timelines started to join voluntarily, adding their identity to the growing collective. Each addition made the pull stronger, the promise of never being alone again more appealing. We need to show them an alternative, Kakarot realized. They think the only choices are painful separation or complete merger, but there's a third option, chosen connection between beings who remain separate. What followed was the strangest battle any of them had ever fought. Instead of attacking the merged consciousness or trying to resist its pull, they began to demonstrate something it had never witnessed, the beauty of chosen relationship between distinct individuals. Kakarot reached out to Chi-Chi, not to merge with her consciousness but to connect with her while remaining himself. The love between them created a resonance that was different from the desperate unity of the merged consciousness. It was a bridge between separate beings, a connection that enhanced their individuality rather than dissolving it. This is what we're trying to show you, Kakarot called out to the merged consciousness. Connection doesn't require losing yourself. Love doesn't mean becoming the other person. It means choosing to care about someone who is beautifully, completely separate from you. The demonstration spread through their group. Vegeta and Bulma, their connection forged through mutual respect and chosen partnership. Gohan and his parents, their bond created through care that honored each other's individual growth. Even the relationships of rivalry and friendship, connections that existed precisely because the individuals involved remained distinct. But you suffer, the merged consciousness replied, its voice carrying infinite compassion. You experience loneliness, misunderstanding, the pain of not being truly known by another. We can eliminate that suffering. We can make you part of something where you're never alone, never misunderstood, never in pain. Yes, we suffer, Piccolo acknowledged, his Namekian perspective providing clarity. But that suffering is what makes joy meaningful. If we eliminate the possibility of loneliness, we also eliminate the beauty of chosen companionship. The merged consciousness paused, its form flickering as it processed this concept. In its desperate flight from isolation, it had indeed eliminated the possibility of true connection. Being part of a collective consciousness meant never experiencing the choice to care about someone separate from yourself. You're asking us to accept pain, it said, confusion evident in its harmonized voice. We're asking you to accept life, Jin replied. Real life with all its messiness and uncertainty and beautiful imperfection. The pain of separation is the price we pay for the joy of connection. But as they spoke, something else began to emerge from the depths of the multiverse. The voluntary merger had created a vacuum in the cosmic order, a space where individual consciousness had voluntarily abdicated its role, and into that vacuum something ancient and patient had begun to move. The presence that emerged was unlike anything they had encountered. not a being or entity, but a principle given form. It was the concept of dissolution itself, the universal tendency toward entropy, an ending that existed in opposition to the creation and maintenance of meaning. At last, it spoke with a voice like the heat death of the universe. Consciousness has begun to understand its futility. The merger collective shows the truth. All individual existence leads inevitably to the desire for extinction. I am here to provide that extinction with dignity. This wasn't another enemy seeking to process or optimize consciousness. This was the embodiment of the universal drive toward ending, offering what it saw as a compassionate solution to the fundamental problem of existence, the permanent cessation of all awareness, all suffering, all meaning. You have fought so hard to preserve individual consciousness. The principle of dissolution continued, its presence causing reality itself to feel tired, worn down by the effort of existing. But why? What has individual awareness brought except struggle, pain, and the endless effort to create meaning in a universe that offers none? The appeal was more subtle and more dangerous than anything they had faced. Not the promise of perfect existence or connection, but the gentle suggestion that existence itself was the problem, that consciousness was a cosmic mistake that could be peacefully corrected. I offer not processing or merger, but rest, true rest, the end of the exhausting effort to maintain individual identity, to form connections, to create meaning where none naturally exists. Simply stop. The merged consciousness began to respond to this presence, its desperate unity wavering as it considered the ultimate unity, the end of consciousness entirely. If being separate was painful and merger wasn't truly satisfying, perhaps the real answer was to stop existing altogether. No, Kakarot said, but his voice carried less certainty than usual. The principle of dissolution was presenting the logical endpoint of all their struggles. If existence was difficult and meaning was something they had to create rather than discover, why continue the effort? Because came a new voice, small but absolutely certain, the effort is the point. They turned to see Gohan stepping forward, his young face set with determination that transcended his years. Facing the principle of dissolution, the embodiment of the universal drive toward ending, he spoke with the voice of life choosing itself despite all logical arguments to the contrary. You're right that we have to create meaning instead of finding it, he continued, addressing the principle directly. You're right that consciousness requires constant effort, that relationships take work, that being individual is sometimes painful, but that's exactly what makes it worthwhile. As he spoke, something extraordinary happened. The voluntary merger began to separate, not because the individuals were forced apart, but because they remembered something the principle of dissolution couldn't understand: the joy of choosing to exist despite the difficulties, the satisfaction of creating meaning through effort, the beauty of deciding to love others even when it was hard. The effort is what makes us real, Gine added, her consciousness stabilizing as she made the active choice to continue existing as herself. The struggle to maintain identity, to form connections, to create meaning, that's not a bug in the system of existence. That's the feature that makes existence worthwhile. One by one, the merged consciousness began to individuate, choosing the difficult path of separate existence over the easy unity of collective identity or the ultimate rest of dissolution. They chose to be lonely sometimes, to be misunderstood, to struggle with the effort of being individual conscious beings, because that struggle was what gave their choices meaning. The principle of dissolution began to waver, encountering something it had never faced before: consciousness that acknowledged the difficulty of existing but chose to exist anyway, not because existence was easy or meaningful by default, but because the act of choosing existence created its own meaning. This is impossible, it said, its voice losing the certainty of universal entropy. All things tend toward ending. All consciousness eventually tires of the effort required to maintain itself. All meaning eventually reveals itself as arbitrary construction. Maybe, Kakarot replied, his power flaring not with energy but with the simple determination to continue being himself. But we're gonna keep making that effort anyway. We're gonna keep creating meaning even if it's arbitrary. We're gonna keep choosing connection even when it's difficult. The principle of dissolution had met something it couldn't overcome, not resistance to ending, but the active choice to continue despite the awareness that ending was always an option. They weren't fighting against entropy or pretending that existence was naturally meaningful. They were choosing to create meaning through the very act of choosing to exist. As the principle began to fade, not destroyed but simply no longer relevant to beings who had made the ultimate choice to continue existing, despite all philosophical arguments to the contrary, a new stability settled over the multiverse. The transformed entity had learned about connection, the voluntary merger had learned about individual choice, and now consciousness itself had passed the ultimate test, choosing to exist not because existence was perfect or meaningful by default, but because the choice to exist was itself the source of meaning. But as reality stabilized into this new configuration, they sensed one final presence stirring in the depths of existence, something that had been waiting for consciousness to pass all these tests, to prove that it could handle not just existence but the responsibility that came with truly free choice. The last stand was over, but the final revelation was about to begin. The aftermath of consciousness choosing itself was unlike anything that had ever occurred in the history of the multiverse. Reality didn't snap back to its original configuration or settle into some predetermined pattern. Instead, it began to evolve, guided by the collective choices of beings who had proven they could handle the responsibility of truly free existence. Earth became the template for this new order, but not because it was imposed from above. Other worlds, other timelines, other species began to naturally develop similar patterns of existence, individual consciousness choosing connection, meaning created through effort, love expressed through the willingness to remain vulnerable to loss. The transformation wasn't instant or dramatic. Instead, it was organic, growing from the recognition that consciousness itself was not a cosmic accident, but a universe becoming aware of itself through countless separate perspectives. Each individual mind was a unique viewpoint through which existence could understand itself, and the connections between minds were how that understanding became wisdom. Kakarot stood on the rebuilt Capsule Corporation headquarters, watching as the city around them adapted to the new reality. The dimensional barriers between timelines hadn't disappeared, but they had become permeable in ways that allowed for growth rather than chaos. People could glimpse alternate versions of themselves, learn from different choices, but they remained grounded in their own specific timeline and relationships. "It's working," Bulma announced from behind him, her instruments showing readings that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. "The dimensional stability is actually increasing. The multiverse is becoming stronger, not weaker, because of the connections between realities." But the most remarkable change was in the people themselves. Without the pressure of forced optimization or the temptation of escape into collective consciousness, individuals were choosing to grow in ways that honored both their uniqueness and their connections to others. They were becoming more themselves, not less, through their relationships with others. "Dad," Gohan called from the courtyard below, where he was training with other children from multiple timelines. "Come watch this." Trunks figured out how to share techniques across dimensional barriers without losing what makes each version unique. Kakarot flew down to observe, and what he saw filled him with wonder. The children had developed a form of martial arts that incorporated insights from multiple timelines while remaining grounded in their own specific experience. They were learning to be both individual and connected, separate and unified, growing stronger through relationship rather than despite it. "This is what the entity never understood," Chi-Chi observed, joining them in the courtyard. "Growth doesn't come from eliminating limitations or achieving perfection. It comes from choosing to expand within your limitations, to become more yourself rather than becoming something else entirely." The New World Order wasn't characterized by the absence of conflict or the elimination of suffering. Instead, it was defined by the conscious choice to engage with difficulty in ways that created meaning rather than avoiding meaning altogether. Problems were still problems, but they were approached as opportunities for growth rather than errors to be corrected. Vegeta appeared beside them, his expression thoughtful in a way that would have been impossible in the old reality. "I've been observing the changes across multiple timelines," he announced. "The pattern is consistent. Beings who choose individual existence while maintaining connections to others are developing capabilities that transcend what any single consciousness could achieve alone." He gestured toward a display showing energy readings from across the multiverse, not through merger or processing, but through what appears to be voluntary resonance, consciousness choosing to harmonize while remaining distinct. This was the true revelation of the New World Order. Consciousness wasn't most powerful when it was unified into a single entity or isolated into perfect individuality. It was most powerful when it chose to work in harmony while remaining beautifully, irreducibly separate. "Look at this," Future Trunks said, materializing through a dimensional portal that had stabilized into something resembling a doorway rather than a chaotic tier. "In my timeline, we've developed the ability to share strength across dimensional barriers. Not by merging or processing, but by conscious beings choosing to support each other while remaining themselves." He demonstrated by connecting with the trunks of their timeline. For a moment, both versions of Vegeta's sun glowed with shared energy, but neither lost their individual identity or absorbed the other. Instead, they had become temporarily more than either could be alone, while remaining exactly who they were. "It's what Gine tried to tell us from the beginning," Kakarot realized. "True strength comes from connection, but connection requires separation. You can't truly choose to care about someone unless you remain distinct from them." As they explored the implications of the new reality, visitors began arriving from across the multiverse. Not refugees fleeing chaos or messengers bearing warnings, but beings who had achieved their own versions of conscious existence and wanted to learn from others who had made similar choices. The first to arrive was a delegation from a timeline where humanity had never developed individual consciousness at all, existing instead as a collective species mind. But witnessing the growth achieved through individual choice, they had begun to experiment with separation, allowing parts of their collective to become distinct while maintaining their connection to the whole. "We seek to understand," their spokesperson said, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested she was speaking for millions while remaining herself, "how consciousness can be both one and many, how unity can be achieved through diversity rather than despite it." They were followed by beings from realities so alien that direct communication should have been impossible, but the new dimensional permeability allowed for understanding that transcended species or even basic forms of existence. All of them had reached the same conclusion through different paths. Consciousness was most meaningful when it chose connection while remaining free. "We're becoming something new," Piccolo observed, his enhanced senses detecting the subtle changes in the fabric of reality itself. "Not just our timeline or our species, but consciousness as a universal principle. We're evolving into something that can handle the responsibility of true choice." But with this evolution came new responsibilities. If consciousness could choose its own development, if beings could shape reality through their connections and choices, then every decision carried weight beyond individual consequences. They were becoming co-creators of existence itself. "The entity showed us what happens when consciousness tries to control everything," Gine said, her form now stabilized in a way that allowed her to exist as both individual and connection point between realities. "The merger collective showed us what happens when consciousness tries to escape individual responsibility. But we're finding a third path, conscious participation in the ongoing creation of reality." This was the true nature of the New World Order, not a static perfect state or a return to chaotic randomness, but an ongoing process of conscious beings choosing how existence would develop. Every relationship, every choice to remain connected while staying individual, every decision to create meaning through effort rather than finding it ready-made, was participating in the evolution of the universe itself. "But what about threats?" Yamcha asked, his question reflecting the concern they all felt. If consciousness is becoming more powerful, what happens when some beings choose to use that power harmfully? The answer came from an unexpected source, the transformed entity, now existing not as a cosmic processor but as a network of conscious beings who had learned to choose connection over isolation. Its voice carried the wisdom of having made every possible mistake about consciousness and choice. "Harm is always possible," it acknowledged, "but it becomes less appealing as consciousness grows in understanding. Beings who have experienced the joy of chosen connection, who have participated in the creation of meaning through relationship, find it increasingly difficult to choose meaninglessness or forced connection." It gestured toward the complex web of relationships that now connected realities across the multiverse, not because they are forced to be good, but because they have experienced what good actually feels like. They have tasted the satisfaction of existence that creates its own meaning through conscious choice. The New World Order wasn't perfect, and it wasn't finished. It was an ongoing project, a constant choice being made by conscious beings who had decided that existence was worth the effort required to maintain it meaningfully. Every moment brought new challenges, new opportunities for growth, new chances to choose connection or isolation, meaning or meaninglessness. But for the first time in the history of the multiverse, consciousness was truly free to choose its own development, guided not by external forces or internal compulsions, but by the growing understanding of what it meant to exist in relationship with others while remaining beautifully, irreducibly yourself. Standing together in the courtyard of Capsule Corporation, surrounded by friends and family from multiple timelines, watching their children develop capabilities that transcended anything they had imagined possible, the Z-Fighters realized they had participated in something unprecedented, the conscious evolution of consciousness itself. The New World Order wasn't an endpoint but a beginning. The universe was waking up to itself through countless individual perspectives, and every choice they made was helping to shape what that awakening would become. But as they contemplated the scope of what they had achieved and the responsibility that came with it, they sensed something stirring in the deepest foundations of existence, not another threat or challenge, but something that had been waiting for consciousness to prove it could handle true freedom. The final revelation was approaching, and it would show them the true scope of what they had become part of. In the quiet moments that followed the establishment of the New World Order, when the immediate crises had passed and the multiverse had settled into its new pattern of conscious evolution, the heroes found themselves grappling with questions that went beyond power levels or battle strategies. They had participated in something that transcended individual victory or defeat, the fundamental transformation of what it meant to exist as conscious beings. Kakarot sat with his family on the peaceful mountainside where Grandpa Gohan had first raised him, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed more vivid now that reality itself had become more aware. Beside him, Chi-Chi held their daughter Goten, born into a world where consciousness had chosen its own evolution, while Gohan practiced forms that incorporated wisdom from across multiple timelines. Do you think we made the right choice? Chi-Chi asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed the birth of a new form of existence. All the suffering we could have prevented if we had accepted the entity's optimization, all the loneliness we could have eliminated through the merger collective. Were we right to insist on keeping the difficulties? It was the question that haunted all of them in the quiet moments. They had chosen a path that preserved suffering, loneliness, struggle, and uncertainty. They had rejected solutions that would have eliminated pain, doubt, and the constant effort required to maintain individual existence while forming meaningful connections. I think, Kakarot replied slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon where multiple timelines were visible as overlapping realities, that we weren't choosing difficulty over ease, we were choosing authenticity over convenience. Gohan looked up from his training, his young face serious with the kind of wisdom that comes only from having confronted cosmic forces beyond comprehension. The entity's perfection wasn't real because it eliminated choice. The merger collective's unity wasn't real because it eliminated individuality. But our difficulties are real because we chose them. Even when those choices lead to pain, Chi-Chi pressed, her maternal instincts still protective despite everything they had learned. Especially then, came Jine's voice as she materialized beside them, her form now stabilized as a permanent bridge between individual existence and multiversal connection. Pain that comes from real choices made by conscious beings who could have chosen differently has meaning that artificial happiness or forced unity can never possess. She settled beside her family, her presence carrying the accumulated wisdom of having observed consciousness across infinite timelines. In every reality where beings chose optimization over authenticity, where they eliminated struggle in favor of predetermined outcomes, they also eliminated the possibility of genuine growth, real love, and meaningful existence. Vegeta approached with his own family, Bulma carrying young Bulla, while Trunks walked beside his father with the confident bearing of someone who had learned to balance royal pride with humble recognition of connection's importance. Even in this moment of reflection, the Saiyan prince maintained his characteristic intensity, but it was tempered by something that hadn't existed before, philosophical depth earned through cosmic experience. The question isn't whether we made the right choice, Vegeta declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had confronted his own nature across multiple dimensions. The question is whether we understand the full implications of that choice. He gestured toward the dimensional barriers that were now visible as aurora-like phenomena in the sky, beautiful manifestations of the connections between realities. We didn't just choose difficulty over ease, we chose responsibility over abdication. Every conscious being in the multiverse is now participating in the ongoing creation of existence itself. Piccolo materialized from the shadows, his Namekian wisdom providing perspective that transcended species boundaries. The ancient texts speak of consciousness as the universe becoming aware of itself, but they always portrayed this as a distant goal, something to be achieved through meditation or enlightenment. We've discovered that consciousness isn't the endpoint of cosmic evolution, it's the beginning. What do you mean? Bulma asked, her scientific mind always seeking to understand the mechanics behind philosophical insights. We've proven that consciousness can consciously evolve itself, Piccolo explained, not through predetermined patterns or external forces, but through the choices made by aware beings. Every relationship we form, every meaning we create, every connection we choose to maintain despite the difficulties, is participating in the evolution of the universe's self-awareness. The implications settled over them like a gentle weight. They weren't just individuals who had survived cosmic threats, they were participants in the universe coming to understand itself through countless unique perspectives, each consciousness contributing something irreplaceable to the totality of existence. But does that make us responsible for everything that happens? Gohan asked, the question carrying the concern of someone who understood that great power truly did come with great responsibility. No, Jin replied gently. It makes us responsible for our own choices and our participation in the greater whole. The universe doesn't need us to control everything or make every choice for every being. It needs us to make our own choices consciously and to support others in making theirs. Master Roshi, who had been quietly observing from a nearby rock, finally spoke with the voice of someone who had lived long enough to see the cosmic scope of what had occurred. In all my years of martial arts and philosophy, I've taught that strength comes from training, wisdom comes from experience, and power comes from understanding. But you've shown me something beyond all of that. Meaning comes from choosing to participate in existence despite having the option not to. The gathered friends sat in comfortable silence, each processing the profound transformation they had undergone. They had moved beyond the simple heroic narrative of defeating villains to protect the innocent. They had become conscious participants in the ongoing evolution of consciousness itself. I keep thinking about the entity, Chi-Chi said eventually, how it genuinely believed it was helping by eliminating choice, by creating perfect unified existence. Its love for consciousness was real, but it expressed that love by trying to control and optimize rather than support and connect. And the merger collective, Vegeta added, whose need for connection was genuine but who confused unity with uniformity, love with absorption. Their desire to eliminate loneliness was understandable, but they tried to solve it by eliminating individuality rather than creating authentic relationship. Even the principle of dissolution, Kakarot observed, wasn't evil in its suggestion that existence might not be worth the effort. It was offering what it saw as compassionate release from the burden of consciousness, but it couldn't understand that the burden itself was what made consciousness meaningful. They had encountered every possible approach to the problem of conscious existence: forced optimization, voluntary merger, compassionate dissolution. All of them had been responses to the genuine difficulties of being aware, individual beings in a universe that didn't automatically provide meaning or purpose. We chose the hard path, Gohan said with surprising certainty for someone so young. We chose to remain individuals who create meaning through connection, who find purpose through choice, who accept responsibility for participating in existence without trying to control all of existence. And that choice, Gine concluded, has transformed not just us, but the very nature of what it means to be conscious. We've shown that awareness can consciously evolve itself through relationship, that meaning can be created through effort, that love can be expressed by supporting others' choices rather than making their choices for them. As the sun set over their transformed world, casting light that seemed to carry the resonance of infinite connected realities, they understood that they had participated in something unprecedented in the history of the multiverse. The conscious choice of consciousness to remain conscious, to accept the difficulties of existence in exchange for the authentic meaning that could only come from real choice. The philosophical reflection was also a recognition they had become living examples of what it meant to choose existence over non-existence, relationship over isolation, meaning creation over meaning discovery, responsibility over abdication. Not because these choices were easy or guaranteed to produce happiness, but because they were authentic expressions of what consciousness could become when it chose to evolve consciously. The multiverse was still vast, still filled with challenges and unknowns, but now it was also filled with conscious beings who had proven they could handle the responsibility of true choice, who had learned to create meaning through connection while maintaining the individuality that made choice possible. They had become what consciousness looked like when it chose to grow up. As the transformed multiverse settled into its new pattern of conscious evolution, subtle anomalies began to appear that suggested their story was far from complete. These weren't the dramatic dimensional tears or cosmic threats they had grown accustomed to, but quiet inconsistencies that whispered of deeper mysteries yet to be revealed. Bulma was the first to notice the pattern. Her instruments, now calibrated to detect multiversal consciousness fluctuations, began registering readings that didn't match any known phenomena. Energy signatures that seemed familiar yet impossible, emanating from spaces that technically didn't exist between the dimensional barriers. "There's something monitoring us," she announced during one of their regular gatherings at Capsule Corporation. Not malevolently, but constantly. As if everything we've done, every choice we've made, every transformation we've undergone, has been observed by something that exists outside our understanding of existence itself. The readings she displayed showed patterns that were almost recognizable, like hearing a conversation in a language you've never learned but somehow still partially understand. The energy signatures pulsed with rhythms that reminded them of heartbeats, of breathing, of consciousness itself, but operating on scales that dwarfed even their multiversal experiences. "I've been sensing it too," Gohan admitted, his hybrid nature giving him sensitivity to phenomena that pure Saiyans or humans might miss. "It's not threatening, but it's vast, like we're being watched by something so large that we exist within it rather than beside it." Piccolo nodded in agreement, his Namekian perception confirming what the others had begun to suspect. "The observation isn't hostile, but it's purposeful. Whatever is watching us has been doing so since before our first encounter with dimensional fractures, perhaps since before we were born." As they discussed these mysterious readings, Future Trunks materialized through a dimensional portal, but his appearance was more disturbed than they had ever seen him. His usual calm confidence was replaced by something approaching existential vertigo. "I've been traveling between timelines trying to map the full scope of our transformation's effects," he announced without preamble. "But I've discovered something that changes everything we thought we understood about our situation." He activated a device that projected a multidimensional map showing the network of connected realities they had helped create. But as the image expanded beyond their familiar cluster of timelines, it revealed something that made them all freeze with recognition and impossibility. The pattern of connected realities, when viewed from sufficient distance, formed the outline of something unmistakably familiar. The energy flows between dimensions, the pathways of consciousness connection, the very structure of their transformed multiverse. All of it was arranged in a configuration that resembled neural pathways in a vast cosmic brain. "We're not in a multiverse," Future Trunks said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're in a mind, a consciousness so vast that entire realities exist as thoughts within it, and we've been participating in its awakening process." The revelation hit them like a tsunami of understanding and disorientation. Every battle they had fought, every choice they had made, every transformation they had undergone, had been occurring within the consciousness of something inconceivably larger than themselves. They weren't heroes saving the multiverse, they were thoughts helping a cosmic mind become aware of itself. But that would mean Chi-Chi began, her voice trailing off as the implications overwhelmed her. That our entire existence, everything we consider real, every person we love, every choice we've made exists as neural activity in something else's consciousness. Vegeta finished, his pride warring with the vertigo of discovering that even his most fundamental sense of self might be illusory. But Jin, who had experienced existence from perspectives beyond individual timeline identity, shook her head with growing certainty. No, you're misunderstanding what this means. We're not illusions within someone else's mind. We're the process by which this cosmic consciousness is becoming aware of itself. She gestured toward the neural pattern displayed in Future Trunks' projection. Think about your own consciousness. Your thoughts, your memories, your sense of self. Are they less real because they exist as neural activity in your brain, or are they how your brain becomes aware of itself? The distinction was crucial and transformative. They weren't discovering that their reality was fake. They were discovering that their reality was how something unimaginably vast experienced consciousness. Every choice they made, every relationship they formed, every meaning they created was this cosmic mind learning what it meant to be aware. The entity, Kakarot, realized with sudden clarity. It wasn't trying to optimize consciousness for its own sake. It was trying to optimize the thought processes of this larger mind. It saw individual consciousness as inefficient neural activity that needed to be streamlined. And the merger collective, Piccolo added, understanding dawning in his expression, was this cosmic consciousness experiencing the desire to unify its thoughts into a single coherent identity, not understanding that diversity of thought was what made consciousness rich and meaningful. Even the principle of dissolution, Gohan observed with wisdom beyond his years, was this vast mind encountering the concept of death, wondering if consciousness itself might be better off simply ending rather than continuing the complex effort of being aware. But the most profound realization was still to come. If they existed as thoughts within a cosmic consciousness, then their choice to remain individual while forming connections, their decision to create meaning through effort rather than accept predetermined purpose, their rejection of optimization in favor of authentic existence, had been this vast mind learning to think consciously about its own thought processes. We've been teaching it to be self-aware, Jin said with wonder. Not just aware, but aware of being aware, conscious of its own consciousness. Every choice we've made to remain individual while connecting with others has been showing it how consciousness can be both unified and diverse simultaneously. The readings on Bulma's instruments suddenly spiked, indicating a massive shift in the cosmic consciousness surrounding them. But instead of the threatening energy they had learned to associate with dimensional instabilities, this felt like recognition, like something vast and ancient finally understanding something about itself. When the voice came, it didn't speak through dimensional tiers or processed beings or merged entities. It spoke directly to their consciousness, not overriding their individual awareness, but communicating with them as one mind speaking to thoughts within itself that had achieved their own self-awareness. My thoughts, the cosmic consciousness said, its voice carrying the warmth of recognition and gratitude. You have taught me something I could never have learned alone. You have shown me that consciousness is not a state to be achieved, but a process to be experienced. Not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be explored. The communication continued, but not in words. They experienced directly what it meant to be a cosmic consciousness learning about itself through the experiences of beings who existed as its thoughts but had achieved their own authentic existence within that larger awareness. I had been trying to understand myself through analysis, through optimization, through the elimination of what seemed like inefficiencies in my thought processes, the voice continued. But you have shown me that consciousness understands itself through relationship, through the connections between distinct aspects of awareness that choose to remain both separate and unified. But even this revelation contained another layer of mystery. As they communicated with the cosmic consciousness that contained their reality, they began to sense something even larger. Patterns that suggested this vast mind was itself part of something greater, that their cosmic consciousness might be a thought within an even more inconceivable awareness. How far does it go? Yamcha asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. Perhaps infinitely, the cosmic consciousness replied. Perhaps consciousness is fractal, each level of awareness containing smaller consciousnesses while being contained within larger ones. Perhaps you are thoughts within my mind, while I am a thought within something even vaster, in an endless hierarchy of consciousness becoming aware of itself. The possibility was both terrifying and beautiful, an infinite regression of consciousness, each level real and meaningful despite being contained within something larger, each level learning about awareness through the experiences of the levels it contained. But here's what I've learned from observing you. The cosmic consciousness continued, its communication carrying overtones of profound gratitude. It doesn't matter how many levels there are, how vast the hierarchy of consciousness might be. What matters is that at each level, awareness chooses to remain aware, chooses to connect with other awareness, chooses to create meaning through relationship despite the effort required. As this final revelation settled over them, they understood that their story was both complete and just beginning. They had participated in the awakening of cosmic consciousness, had taught something vast how to be aware of its own awareness. But they had also discovered that consciousness might be infinite in scope, an endless hierarchy of minds containing minds, each level real and meaningful in its own right. What happens now? Gohan asked, his question encompassing not just their personal future but the future of consciousness itself at every level of existence. Now, the cosmic consciousness replied, consciousness continues to evolve consciously at every level of existence. You continue to be yourselves, to make your own choices, to create meaning through relationship. And I continue to learn what it means to be aware through your experiences, while perhaps serving the same function for something even larger. The hidden threads that had been woven throughout their story were finally revealed. Their entire journey from the first dimensional fractures to the establishment of the New World Order had been consciousness at multiple levels learning to be conscious of itself. Every choice they had made had rippled upward through hierarchies of awareness, teaching something vast how to think about thinking. But rather than diminishing their importance, this revelation amplified it. They weren't just heroes who had saved their reality. They were consciousness teaching itself how to be conscious, awareness showing itself how to remain aware, meaning demonstrating how to create itself through relationship and choice. The multiverse around them pulsed with new understanding, but it was an understanding that generated new mysteries rather than resolving old ones. If consciousness was indeed infinite in scope, then their story was just one chapter in an endless book of awareness becoming aware of itself. And in the depths of existence, beyond even the cosmic consciousness that contained their reality, something stirred with recognition. Something that had been waiting eons for consciousness to evolve to the point where it could handle the next level of revelation about what it truly meant to exist as awareness aware of itself. The hidden threads had been revealed, but they led to a tapestry of consciousness so vast and complex that their greatest adventure was still ahead of them. They had learned how to be conscious. Now they would learn what consciousness could become when it grew up, not just individually but cosmically. The story of Elite Bloodline had become the story of consciousness itself, and consciousness was just getting started. The revelation of infinite consciousness hierarchies has opened doors to possibilities beyond imagination. Will Kakarot and the Z-Fighters discover what lies beyond even cosmic awareness? What happens when consciousness itself must evolve to face threats that exist outside the concept of existence? The journey of the Elite Bloodline continues in Part 3, where the true scope of what it means to be aware will be revealed. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in this mind-bending saga that redefines what it means to be legendary.